Part 8 of Chance by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 8. Chapter 7. On the Pavement. Fyne was not willing to talk, but as I had been already let into the secret, the fair-minded little man recognized that I had some right to information if I insisted on it. And I did insist, after the third game. We were yet some way from the end of our journey. "Oh, if you want to know," was his somewhat impatient opening, and then he talked rather volubly. First of all, his wife had not given him to read the letter received from Flora. I had suspected him of having it in his pocket, but had told him all about the contents. It was not at all what it should have been, even if the girl had wished to affirm her right to disregard the feelings of all the world. Her own had been trampled in the dirt out of all shape. Extraordinary thing to say, I would admit, for a young girl of her age. The whole tone of that letter was wrong, quite wrong. It was certainly not the product of a well-balanced mind. "If she were given some sort of footing in the world," I said, "if only no bigger than the palm of my hand, she would probably learn to keep a better balance." Fyne ignored this little remark. His wife, he said, was not the sort of person to be addressed mockingly on a serious subject. There was an unpleasant strain of levity in that letter, extending even to the references of Captain Anthony himself. Such a disposition was enough, his wife had pointed out to him, to alarm one for the future, had all the circumstances of that preposterous project been as satisfactory as, in fact, they were not. Other parts of the letter seemed to have a challenging tone, as if daring them, the Fynes, to approve her conduct, and at the same time implying that she did not care, that it was for their own sakes that she hoped they would go against the world, the horrid world which had crushed poor papa. Fyne called upon me to admit that this was pretty cool, considering. And there was another thing too. It seems that for the last 6 months she had been assisting two ladies who kept a kindergarten school in Bayswater, a mere pittance. Flora had insisted on devoting all her spare time to the study of the trial. She had been looking up files of old newspapers and working herself up into a state of indignation with what she called the injustice and the hypocrisy of the prosecution. Her father, Fyne reminded me, had made some palpable hits in his answers in court, and she had fastened on them triumphantly. She had reached the conclusion of her father's innocence and had been brooding over it. Mrs. Fyne had pointed out to him the danger of this. The train ran into the station, and Fyne, jumping out directly it came to a standstill, seemed glad to cut short the conversation. We walked in silence a little way, boarded a bus, then walked again. I don't suppose that since the days of his childhood, when surely he was taken to see the Tower, he had been once east of Temple Bar. He looked about him sullenly, and when I pointed out in the distance the rounded front of the Eastern Hotel, at the bifurcation of two very broad, mean, shabby thoroughfares, rising like a grey stucco tower above the lowly roofs of the dirty yellow two-story houses, he only grunted disapprovingly. "I wouldn't lay too much stress on what you have been telling me," I observed quietly as we approached that unattractive building. "No man will believe a girl who has just accepted his suit to be not well balanced, you know." "Oh, accepted his suit," muttered Fyne, who seemed to have been very thoroughly convinced indeed. "It may have been the other way about." And then he added, "I am going through with it." I said that this was very praiseworthy, but that a certain moderation of statement He waved his hand at me and mended his pace. I guessed that he was anxious to get his mission over as quickly as possible. He barely gave himself time to shake hands with me and made a rush at the narrow glass door with the words "Hotel Entrance" on it. It swung to behind his back with no more noise than the snap of a toothless jaw. The absurd temptation to remain and see what would come of it got over my better judgment. I hung about irresolute, wondering how long an embassy of that sort would take, and whether Fyne on coming out would consent to be communicative. I feared he would be shocked at finding me there, would consider my conduct incorrect, conceivably treat me with contempt. I walked off a few paces. Perhaps it would be possible to read something on Fyne's face as he came out. And if necessary, I could always eclipse myself discreetly through the door of one of the bars. The ground floor of the Eastern Hotel was an unabashed pub with plate glass fronts, a display of brass rails, and divided into many compartments each having its own entrance. But of course all this was silly. The marriage, the love, the affairs of Captain Anthony were none of my business. I was on the point of moving down the street for good when my attention was attracted by a girl approaching the hotel entrance from the west. She was dressed very modestly in black. It was the white straw hat of good form and trimmed with a bunch of pale roses which had caught my eye. The whole figure seemed familiar. Of course, Flora de Barral. She was making for the hotel. She was going in. And Fyne was with Captain Anthony. To meet him could not be pleasant for her. I wished to save her from the awkwardness, and as I hesitated what to do she looked up and our eyes happened to meet just as she was turning off the pavement into the hotel doorway. Instinctively I extended my arm. It was enough to make her stop. I suppose she had some faint notion that she had seen me before somewhere. She walked slowly forward, prudent and attentive, watching my faint smile. "Excuse me," I said directly she had approached me near enough. "Perhaps you would like to know that Mr. Fyne is upstairs with Captain Anthony at this moment." She uttered a faint "Ah, Mr. Fyne." I could read in her eyes that she had recognized me now. Her serious expression extinguished the imbecile grin of which I was conscious. I raised my hat. She responded with a slow inclination of the head, while her luminous, mistrustful, maiden's glance seemed to whisper, "What is this one doing here?" "I came up to town with Fyne this morning," I said in a business-like tone. "I have to see a friend in East India Dock. Fyne and I parted this moment at the door here." The girl regarded me with darkening eyes. "Mrs. Fyne did not come with her husband," I went on, then hesitated before that white face so still in the pearly shadow thrown down by the hat brim. "But she sent him," I murmured by way of warning. Her eyelids fluttered slowly over the fixed stare. I imagine she was not much disconcerted by this development. "I live a long way from here," she whispered. I said perfunctorily, "Do you?" And we remained gazing at each other. The uniform paleness of her complexion was not that of an anaemic girl. It had a transparent vitality, and at that particular moment the faintest possible rosy tinge, the merest suspicion of colour, an equivalent I suppose in any other girl to blushing like a peony, while she told me that Captain Anthony had arranged to show her the ship that morning. It was easy to understand that she did not want to meet Fyne, and when I mentioned in a discreet murmur that he had come because of her letter, she glanced at the hotel door quickly and moved off a few steps to a position where she could watch the entrance without being seen. I followed her. At the junction of the two thoroughfares she stopped in the thin traffic of the broad pavement and turned to me with an air of challenge. "And so you know." I told her that I had not seen the letter. I had only heard of it. She was a little impatient. "I mean all about me." Yes, I knew all about her. The distress of Mr. and Mrs. Fyne, especially of Mrs. Fyne, was so great that they would have shared it with anybody almost, not belonging to their circle of friends. I happened to be at hand. That was all. "You understand that I am not their friend. I am only a holiday acquaintance." "She was not very much upset?" queried Flora de Barral, meaning of course Mrs. Fyne. And I admitted that she was less so than her husband, and even less than myself. Mrs. Fyne was a very self-possessed person, which nothing could startle out of her extreme theoretical position. She did not seem startled when Fyne and I proposed going to the quarry. "You put that notion into their heads," the girl said. I advanced that the notion was in their heads already, but it was much more vividly in my head since I had seen her up there with my own eyes, tempting Providence. She was looking at me with extreme attention and murmured: "Is that what you called it to them? Tempting?" "No, I told them that you were making up your mind, and I came along just then. I told them that you were saved by me. My shout checked you." She moved her head gently from right to left in negation. "No? Well, have it your own way." I thought to myself, she has found another issue. She wants to forget now. And no wonder. She wants to persuade herself that she had never known such an ugly and poignant minute in her life. After all, I conceded aloud, things are not always what they seem. Her little head with its deep blue eyes, eyes of tenderness and anger under the black arch of fine eyebrows, was very still. The mouth looked very red in the white face peeping from under the veil. The little pointed chin had in its form something aggressive. Slight and even angular in her modest black dress she was an appealing and, yes, she was a desirable little figure. Her lips moved very fast, asking me: "And they believed you at once?" "Yes, they believed me at once." Mrs. Fyne's word to us was "Go." A white gleam between the red lips was so short that I remained uncertain whether it was a smile or a ferocious baring of little even teeth. The rest of the face preserved its innocent, tense and enigmatical expression. She spoke rapidly. "No, it wasn't your shout. I had been there some time before you saw me. And I was not there to tempt Providence, as you call it. I went up there for what you thought I was going to do. Yes, I climbed 2 fences. I did not mean to leave anything to Providence. There seem to be people for whom Providence can do nothing. I suppose you are shocked to hear me talk like that." I shook my head. I was not shocked. What had kept her back all that time till I appeared on the scene below, she went on, was neither fear nor any other kind of hesitation. "One reaches a point," she said with appalling youthful simplicity, "where nothing that concerns one matters any longer." But something did keep her back. I should have never guessed what it was. She herself confessed that it seemed absurd to say. It was the Fyne dog. Flora de Barral paused, looking at me with a peculiar expression, and then went on. "You see, she imagined the dog had become extremely attached to her. She took it into her head that he might fall over or jump down after her. She tried to drive him away. She spoke sternly to him. It only made him more frisky. He barked and jumped about her skirt in his usual idiotic high spirits. He scampered away in circles between the pines, charging upon her and leaping as high as her waist. She commanded, "Go away, go home." She even picked up from the ground a bit of broken branch and threw it at him. At this his delight knew no bounds. His rushes became faster, his yapping louder. He seemed to be having the time of his life. She was convinced that the moment she threw herself down he would spring over after her as if it were part of the game. She was vexed almost to tears. She was touched too. And when he stood still at some distance as if suddenly rooted to the ground, wagging his tail slowly and watching her intensely with his shining eyes, another fear came to her. She imagined herself gone, and the creature sitting on the brink, its head thrown up to the sky and howling for hours. This thought was not to be borne. Then my shout reached her ears. She told me all this with simplicity. My voice had destroyed her poise, the suicide poise of her mind. Every act of ours, the most criminal, the most mad, presupposes a balance of thought, feeling and will, like a correct attitude for an effective stroke in a game. And I had destroyed it. She was no longer in proper form for the act. She was not very much annoyed. Next day would do. She would have to slip away without attracting the notice of the dog. She thought of the necessity almost tenderly. She came down the path carrying her despair with lucid calmness. But when she saw herself deserted by the dog, she had an impulse to turn round, go up again and be done with it. Not even that animal cared for her in the end. I really did think that she was attached to me. What did he want to pretend for like this? I thought nothing could hurt me any more. Oh yes, I would have gone up, but I felt suddenly so tired, so tired. And then you were there. I didn't know what you would do. You might have tried to follow me, and I didn't think I could run, not uphill, not then." She had raised her white face a little, and it was queer to hear her say these things. At that time of the morning there are comparatively few people out in that part of the town. The broad interminable perspective of the East India Dock Road, the great perspective of drab brick walls, of grey pavement, of muddy roadway rumbling dismally with loaded carts and vans, lost itself in the distance, imposing and shabby in its spacious meanness of aspect, in its immeasurable poverty of forms, of colouring, of life, under a harsh, unconcerned sky, dried by the wind to a clear blue. It had been raining during the night. The sunshine itself seemed poor. From time to time a few bits of paper, a little dust and straw whirled past us on the broad flat promontory of the pavement before the rounded front of the hotel. Flora de Barral was silent for a while. I said, "And next day you thought better of it." Again she raised her eyes to mine with that peculiar expression of informed innocence, and again her white cheeks took on the faintest tinge of pink, the merest shadow of a blush. "Next day," she uttered distinctly. "I didn't think. I remembered. That was enough. I remembered what I would never have forgotten. Never. And Captain Anthony arrived at the cottage in the evening." "Ah, yes, Captain Anthony," I murmured. And she repeated also in a murmur, "Yes, Captain Anthony." The faint flush of warm life left her face. I subdued my voice still more, and not looking at her, "You found him sympathetic?" I ventured. Her long dark lashes went down a little with an air of calculated discretion. At least so it seemed to me. And yet No one could say that I was inimical to the girl. But there you are. Explain it as you may, in this world the friendless, like the poor, are always a little suspect, as if honesty and delicacy were only possible to the privileged few. "Why do you ask?" she said after a time, raising her eyes suddenly to mine in an effect of candour, which on the same principle of the disinherited not being to be trusted, might have been judged equivocal. "If you mean what right I have." She moved slightly a hand in a worn brown glove, as much as to say she could not question anyone's right against such an outcast as herself. I ought to have been moved perhaps, but I only noted the total absence of humility. "Not right at all," I continued, "but just interest. Mrs. Fyne, it's too difficult to explain how it came about, has talked to me of you, well, extensively." No doubt Mrs. Fyne had told me the truth, Flora said brusquely, with an unexpected hoarseness of tone. This very dress she was wearing had been given her by Mrs. Fyne. Of course I looked at it. It could not have been a recent gift. Close fitting and black, with heliotrope silk facings under a figured net, it looked far from new, just on this side of shabbiness. In fact, it accentuated the slightness of her figure. It went well in its suggestion of half mourning, with the white face in which the unsmiling red lips alone seemed warm with the rich blood of life and passion. Little Fyne was staying up there an unconscionable time. Was he arguing, preaching, remonstrating? Had he discovered in himself a capacity and a taste for that sort of thing? Or was he perhaps in an intense dislike for the job, beating about the bush and only puzzling Captain Anthony, the providential man who, if he expected the girl to appear at any moment, must have been on tenterhooks all the time, and beside himself with impatience to see the back of his brother-in-law? How was it that he had not got rid of Fyne long before, in any case? I don't mean by actually throwing him out of the window, but in some other resolute manner. Surely Fyne had not impressed him. That he was an impressionable man I could not doubt. The presence of the girl there on the pavement before me proved this up to the hilt, and, well, yes, touchingly enough. It so happened that in their wanderings to and fro our glances met. They met and remained in contact more familiar than a hand clasp, more communicative, more expressive. There was something comic too in the whole situation, in the poor girl and myself waiting together on the broad pavement at a corner public house for the issue of Fyne's ridiculous mission. But the comic, when it is human, becomes quickly painful. Yes, she was infinitely anxious, and I was asking myself whether this poignant tension of her suspense depended, to put it plainly, on hunger or love. The answer would have been of some interest to Captain Anthony. For my part, in the presence of a young girl I always become convinced that the dreams of sentiment, like the consoling mysteries of faith, are invincible. That it is never, never reason which governs men and women. Yet what sentiment could there have been on her part? I remembered her tone only a moment since when she said that evening Captain Anthony arrived at the cottage. And considering too what the arrival of Captain Anthony meant in this connection, I wondered at the calmness with which she could mention that fact. He arrived at the cottage in the evening. I knew that late train. He probably walked from the station. The evening would have been well advanced. I could almost see a dark, indistinct figure opening the wicket gate of the garden. Where was she? Did she see him enter? Was she somewhere near by, and did she hear without the slightest premonition his chance and fateful footsteps on the flagged path leading to the cottage door? In the shadow of the night, made more cruelly sombre for her by the very shadow of death, he must have appeared too strange, too remote, too unknown, to impress himself on her thoughts as a living force. Such a force as a man can bring to bear on a woman's destiny. She glanced towards the hotel door. I followed suit, and then our eyes met once more, this time intentionally. A tentative uncertain intimacy was springing up between us two. She said simply, "You are waiting for Mr. Fyne to come out, are you?" I admitted to her that I was waiting to see Mr. Fyne come out. That was all. I had nothing to say to him. "I have said yesterday all I had to say to him," I added meaningly. "I have said it to them both, in fact. I have also heard all they had to say." "About me," she murmured. "Yes, the conversation was about you." "I wonder if they told you everything." If she wondered I could do nothing else but wonder too. But I did not tell her that. I only smiled. The material point was that Captain Anthony should be told everything. But as to that I was very certain that the good sister would see to it. Was there anything more to disclose? Some other misery, some other deception of which that girl had been a victim? It seemed hardly probable. It was not even easy to imagine. What struck me most was her, I suppose I must call it, composure. One could not tell whether she understood what she had done. One wondered. She was not so much unreadable as blank, and I did not know whether to admire her for it or dismiss her from my thoughts as a passive but of ferocious misfortune. Looking back at the occasion when we first got on speaking terms on the road by the quarry, I had to admit that she presented some points of a problematic appearance. I don't know why I imagined Captain Anthony as the sort of man who would not be likely to take the initiative, not perhaps from indifference, but from that peculiar timidity before women which often enough is found in conjunction with chivalrous instincts, with a great need for affection and great stability of feelings. Such men are easily moved. At the least encouragement they go forward with the eagerness, with the recklessness of starvation. This accounted for the suddenness of the affair. No. With all her inexperience this girl could not have found any great difficulty in her conquering enterprise. She must have begun it. And yet there she was, patient, almost unmoved, almost pitiful, waiting outside like a beggar, without a right to anything but compassion for a promised dole. Every moment people were passing close by us, singly, in twos and threes, the inhabitants of that end of the town where life goes on unadorned by grace or splendour. They passed us in their shabby garments, with shallow faces, haggard, anxious or weary, or simply without expression, in an unsmiling, sombre stream not made up of lives but of mere unconsidered existences, whose joys, struggles, thoughts, sorrows, and their very hopes were miserable, glamourless, and of no account in the world. And when one thought of their reality to themselves, one's heart became oppressed. But of all the individuals who passed by none appeared to me for the moment so pathetic in unconscious patience as the girl standing before me. None more difficult to understand. It is perhaps because I was thinking of things which I could not ask her about. In fact, we had nothing to say to each other. But we two, strangers as we really were to each other, had dealt with the most intimate and final of subjects, the subject of death. It had created a sort of bond between us. It made our silence weighty and uneasy. I ought to have left her there and then, but as I think I've told you before, the fact of having shouted her away from the edge of the precipice seemed somehow to have engaged my responsibility as to this one other leap. And so we had still an intimate subject between us to lend more weight and more uneasiness to our silence. The subject of marriage. I use the word not so much in reference to the ceremony itself. I had no doubt of this, Captain Anthony being a decent fellow, or in view of the social institution in general, as to which I have no opinion, but in regard to the human relation. The first two views are not particularly interesting. The ceremony, I suppose, is adequate. The institution, I dare say, is useful, or it would not have endured. But the human relation, thus recognized, is a mysterious thing in its origins, character and consequences. Unfortunately you can't buttonhole familiarly a young girl as you would a young fellow. I don't think that even another woman could really do it. She would not be trusted. There is not between women that fund of at least conditional loyalty which men may depend on in their dealings with each other. I believe that any woman would rather trust a man. The difficulty in such a delicate case was how to get on terms. So we held our peace in the odious uproar of that wide roadway thronged with heavy carts. Great vans carrying enormous piled up loads advanced swaying like mountains. It was as if the whole world existed only for selling and buying, and those who had nothing to do with the movement of merchandise were of no account. "You must be tired," I said. One had to say something if only to assert oneself against that wearisome, passionless and crushing uproar. She raised her eyes for a moment. No, she was not. Not very. She had not walked all the way. She came by train as far as Whitechapel Station and had only walked from there. She had had an ugly pilgrimage, but whether of love or of necessity who could tell? And that precisely was what I should have liked to get at. This was not, however, a question to be asked point blank, and I could not think of any effective circumlocution. It occurred to me too that she might conceivably know nothing of it herself. I mean by reflection. That young woman had been obviously considering death. She had gone the length of forming some conception of it. But as to its companion fatality, love, she, I was certain, had never reflected upon its meaning. With that man in the hotel, whom I did not know, and this girl standing before me in the street, I felt that it was an exceptional case. He had broken away from his surroundings. She stood outside the pale. One aspect of conventions which people who disclaim against them lose sight of is that conventions make both joy and suffering easier to bear in a becoming manner. But those two were outside all conventions. They would be as untrampled in a sense as the first man and the first woman. The trouble was that I could not imagine anything about Flora de Barral and the brother of Mrs. Fyne. Or if you like I could imagine anything which comes practically to the same thing. Darkness and chaos are first cousins. I should have liked to ask the girl for a word which would give my imagination its line. But how was one to venture so far? I can be rough sometimes, but I am not naturally impertinent. I would have liked to ask her, for instance, "Do you know what you have done with yourself?" A question like that. Anyhow, it was time for one of us to say something. A question it must be. And the question I asked was: "So he's going to show you the ship?" She seemed glad I had spoken at last, and glad of the opportunity to speak herself. "Yes, he said he would, this morning. Did you say you did not know Captain Anthony?" "No, I don't know him. Is he anything like his sister?" She looked startled and murmured "Sister" in a puzzled tone which astonished me. "Oh, Mrs. Fyne!" she exclaimed, recollecting herself and avoiding my eyes while I looked at her curiously. What an extraordinary detachment! And all the time the stream of shabby people was hastening by us with the continuous dreary shuffling of weary footsteps on the flagstones. The sunshine falling on the grime of surfaces, on the poverty of tones and forms, seemed of an inferior quality. Its joy faded, its brilliance tarnished and dusty. I had to raise my voice in the dull vibrating noise of the roadway. "You don't mean to say you have forgotten the connection?" She cried readily enough. "I wasn't thinking." And then, while I wondered what could have been the images occupying her brain at this time, she asked me: "You didn't see my letter to Mrs. Fyne, did you?" "No, I didn't," I shouted. Just then the racket was distracting. A pair horse trolley, lightly loaded with loose rods of iron, passing slowly very near us. I wasn't trusted so far, and remembering Mrs. Fyne's hints that the girl was unbalanced, I added: "Was it an unreserved confession you wrote?" She did not answer me for a time, and as I waited I thought that there's nothing like a confession to make one look mad, and that of all confessions a written one is the most detrimental all round. Never confess, never, never. An untimely joke is a source of bitter regret always. Sometimes it may ruin a man, not because it is a joke but because it is untimely. And a confession of whatever sort is always untimely. The only thing which makes it supportable for a while is curiosity. You smile? Ah, but it is so. Or else people would be sent to the right about at the second sentence. How many sympathetic souls can you reckon on in the world? 1 in 10, 1 in 100, in 1,000, in 10,000. Ah! What a sell these confessions are. What a horrible sell. You seek sympathy and all you get is the most evanescent sense of relief. If you get that much, for a confession, whatever it may be, stirs the secret depths of the hearer's character, often depths that he himself is but dimly aware of. And so the righteous triumph secretly. The lucky are amused, the strong are disgusted, the weak either upset or irritated with you according to the measure of their sincerity with themselves. And all of them in their hearts brand you for either mad or impudent. I had seldom seen Marlow so vehement, so pessimistic, so earnestly cynical before. I cut his declamation short by asking what answer Flora de Barral had given to his question. Did the poor girl admit firing off her confidences at Mrs. Fyne, 8 pages of close writing, that sort of thing? Marlow shook his head. She did not tell me. I accepted her silence as a kind of answer and remarked that it would have been better if she had simply announced the fact to Mrs. Fyne at the cottage. "Why didn't you do it?" I asked point blank. She said: "I am not a very plucky girl." She looked up at me and added meaningly: "And you know it. And you know why." I must remark that she seemed to have become very subdued since our first meeting at the quarry. Almost a different person from the defiant, angry and despairing girl with quivering lips and resentful glances. "I thought it was very sensible of you to get away from that sheer drop," I said. She looked up with something of that old expression. "That's not what I mean. I see you will have it that you saved my life. Nothing of the kind. I was concerned for that vile little beast of a dog. No, it was the idea of doing away with myself which was cowardly. That's what I meant by saying I am not a very plucky girl." "Oh," I retorted airily, "that little dog." "He isn't really a bad little dog." But she lowered her eyelids and went on. I was so miserable that I could think only of myself. This was mean. It was cruel too. And besides I had not given it up. Not then. Marlow changed his tone. "I don't know much of the psychology of self-destruction. It's a sort of subject one has few opportunities to study closely. I knew a man once who came to my rooms one evening and while smoking a cigar confessed to me moodily that he was trying to discover some graceful way of retiring out of existence. I didn't study his case, but I had a glimpse of him the other day at a cricket match with some women, having a good time. That seems a fairly reasonable attitude. Considered as a sin, it is a case for repentance before the throne of a merciful God. But I imagine that Flora de Barral's religion under the care of the distinguished governess could have been nothing but outward formality. Remorse in the sense of gnawing shame and unavailing regret is only understandable to me when some wrong has been done to a fellow creature. But why she, that girl who existed on sufferance, so to speak, why she should writhe inwardly with remorse because she had once thought of getting rid of life, which was nothing in every respect but a curse, that I could not understand. I thought it was very likely some obscure influence of common forms of speech, some traditional or inherited feeling, a vague notion that suicide is a legal crime, words of old moralists and preachers which remain in the air and help to form all the authorized moral conventions. Yes, I was surprised at her remorse. But lowering her glance unexpectedly till her dark eyelashes seemed to rest against her white cheeks, she presented a perfectly demure aspect. It was so attractive that I could not help a faint smile. That Flora de Barral should ever in any aspect have the power to evoke a smile was the very last thing I should have believed. She went on after a slight hesitation. "One day I started for that place. Look at the influence of a mere play of physiognomy. If you remember what we were talking about you will hardly believe that I caught myself grinning down at that demure little girl. I must say too that I felt more friendly to her at the moment than ever before." "Oh, you did? To take that jump? You are a determined young person. Well, what happened that time?" An almost imperceptible alteration in her bearing, a slight droop of her head perhaps, a mere nothing, made her look more demure than ever. "I had left the cottage," she began a little hurriedly. "I was walking along the road, you know the road. I had made up my mind I was not coming back this time." I won't deny that these words, spoken from under the brim of her hat oh yes, certainly her head was down, she had put it down, gave me a thrill. For indeed I had never doubted her sincerity. It could never have been a make-believe despair. "Yes," I whispered. "You were going along the road. When" again she hesitated with an effect of innocent shyness, worlds asunder from tragic issues. Then glided on. "When, suddenly, Captain Anthony came through a gate out of a field." I coughed down the beginning of a most improper fit of laughter and felt ashamed of myself. Her eyes raised for a moment seemed full of innocent suffering and unexpected menace in the depths of the dilated pupils within the rings of sombre blue. It was, how shall I say it, a night effect when you seem to see vague shapes and don't know what reality you may come upon at any time. Then she lowered her eyelids again, shutting all mysteriousness out of the situation except for the sobering memory of that glance, night-like in the sunshine, expressively still in the brutal unrest of the street. "So Captain Anthony joined you, did he?" "He opened a field gate and walked out on the road. He crossed to my side and went on with me. He had his pipe in his hand. He said, 'Are you going far this morning?' These words, I was watching her white face as she spoke, gave me a slight shudder. She remained demure, almost prim, and I remarked, 'You have been talking together before, of course.' 'Not more than 20 words altogether since he arrived,' she declared without emphasis. That day he had said good morning to me when we met at breakfast 2 hours before, and I said good morning to him. I did not see him afterwards till he came out on the road. I thought to myself that this was not accidental. He had been observing her. I felt certain also that he had not been asking any questions of Mrs. Fyne. "I wouldn't look at him," said Flora de Barral. "I had done with looking at people. He said to me, 'My sister does not put herself out much for us. We had better keep each other company. I have read every book there is in that cottage.' I walked on. He did not leave me. I thought he ought to, but he didn't. He didn't seem to notice that I would not talk to him." She was now perfectly still. The wretched little parasol hung down against her dress from her joined hands. I was rigid with attention. It isn't every day that one culls such a volunteered tale on a girl's lips. The ugly street noises, swelling up for a moment, covered the next few words she said. It was vexing. The next word I heard was worried. "It worried you to have him there, walking by your side." "Yes, just that," she went on with downcast eyes. There was something prettily comical in her attitude and her tone, while I pictured to myself a poor white-faced girl walking to her death with an unconscious man striding by her side. Unconscious? I don't know. First of all, I felt certain that this was no chance meeting. Something had happened. Was he a man for coup de foudre, the lightning stroke of love? I don't think so. That sort of susceptibility is luckily rare. A world of inflammable lovers of the Romeo and Juliet type would very soon end in barbarism and misery. But it is a fact that in every man, not in every woman, there lives a lover who is called out in all his potentialities, often by the most insignificant little things, as long as they come at the psychological moment. The glimpse of a face at an unusual angle, an evanescent attitude, the curve of a cheek often looked at before perhaps, but then at the moment charged with astonishing significance. These are great mysteries, of course. Magic signs. I don't know in what the sign consisted in this case. It might have been her pallor. It wasn't pasty, not yet papery. That white face with eyes like blue gleams of fire and lips like red coals. In certain lights, in certain poises of head, it suggested tragic sorrow. Or it might have been her wavy hair, or even just that pointed chin stuck out a little, resentful and not particularly distinguished, doing away with the mysterious aloofness of her fragile presence. But anyway at a given moment Anthony must have suddenly seen the girl. And then that something had happened to him. Perhaps nothing more than the thought coming into his head that this was a possible woman. Followed this waylaying. Its resolute character makes me think it was the chin's doing, that common mortal touch which stands in such good stead to some women. Because men, I mean really masculine men, those whose generations have evolved an ideal woman, are often very timid. Who wouldn't be before the ideal? It's your sentimental trifler who has just missed being nothing at all, who is enterprising simply because it is easy to appear enterprising when one does not mean to put one's belief to the test. Well, whatever it was that encouraged him, Captain Anthony stuck to Flora de Barral in a manner which in a timid man might have been called heroic if it had not been so simple. Whether policy, diplomacy, simplicity, or just inspiration, he kept up his talk, rather deliberate, with very few pauses. Then suddenly, as if recollecting himself, "It's funny, I don't think you are annoyed with me for giving you my company unasked, but why don't you say something?" I asked Miss de Barral what answer she made to this query. "I made no answer," she said in that even, unemotional low voice, which seemed to be her voice for delicate confidences. I walked on. He did not seem to mind. We came to the foot of the quarry where the road winds uphill past the place where you were sitting by the roadside that day. I began to wonder what I should do. After we reached the top, Captain Anthony said that he had not been for a walk with a lady for years and years, almost since he was a boy. We had then come to where I ought to have turned off and struck across a field. I thought of making a run of it, but he would have caught me up. I knew he would. And of course he would not have allowed me. I couldn't give him the slip. "Why didn't you ask him to leave you?" I inquired curiously. "He would not have taken any notice," she went on steadily. "And what could I have done then? I could not have started quarrelling with him, could I? I hadn't enough energy to get angry. I felt very tired suddenly. I just stumbled on straight along the road. Captain Anthony told me that the family, some relations of his mother he used to know in Liverpool, was broken up now, and he had never made any friends since. All gone their different ways, all the girls married. Nice girls they were, and very friendly to him when he was but little more than a boy. He repeated, very nice, cheery, clever girls. I sat down on a bank against a hedge and began to cry. "You must have astonished him not a little," I observed. Anthony, it seems, remained on the road looking down at her. He did not offer to approach her, neither did he make any other movement or gesture. Flora de Barral told me all this. She could see him through her tears, blurred to a mere shadow on the white road, and then again becoming more distinct, but always absolutely still and as if lost in thought before a strange phenomenon which demanded the closest possible attention. Flora learned later that he had never seen a woman cry, not in that way at least. He was impressed and interested by the mysteriousness of the effect. She was very conscious of being looked at, but was not able to stop herself crying. In fact, she was not capable of any effort. Suddenly he advanced 2 steps, stooped, caught hold of her hands lying on her lap and pulled her up to her feet. She found herself standing close to him almost before she realized what he had done. Some people were coming briskly along the road, and Captain Anthony muttered, "You don't want to be stared at. What about that stile over there? Can we go across the fields?" She snatched her hands out of his grasp, it seemed he had omitted to let them go, marched away from him and got over the stile. It was a big field, sprinkled profusely with white sheep. A trodden path crossed it diagonally. After she had gone more than half-way she turned her head for the first time. Keeping 5 feet or so behind, Captain Anthony was following her with an air of extreme interest or eagerness. At any rate, she caught an expression on his face which frightened her, but not enough to make her run. And indeed it would have had to be something incredibly awful to scare into a run a girl who had come to the end of her courage to live. As if encouraged by this glance over the shoulder, Captain Anthony came up boldly, and now that he was by her side she felt his nearness intimately, like a touch. She tried to disregard this sensation, but she was not angry with him now. It wasn't worth while. She was thankful that he had the sense not to ask questions as to this crying. Of course he didn't ask because he didn't care. No one in the world cared for her, neither those who pretended nor yet those who did not pretend. She preferred the latter. Captain Anthony opened for her a gate into another field. When they got through he kept walking abreast, elbow to elbow almost. His voice growled pleasantly in her very ear. Staying in this dull place was enough to give anyone the blues. His sister scribbled all day. It was positively unkind. He alluded to his nieces as rude, selfish monkeys, without either feelings or manners, and he went on to talk about his ship being laid up for a month and dismantled for repairs. The worst was that on arriving in London he found he couldn't get the rooms he was used to, where they made him as comfortable as such a confirmed sea dog as himself could be anywhere on shore. In the effort to subdue by dint of talking and to keep in check the mysterious, the profound attraction he felt already for that delicate being of flesh and blood, with pale cheeks, with darkened eyelids and eyes scaled with hot tears, he went on speaking of himself as a confirmed enemy of life on shore, a perfect terror to a simple man, what with the fads and proprieties and the ceremonies and affectations. He hated all that. He wasn't fit for it. There was no rest and peace and security but on the sea. This gave one a view of Captain Anthony as a hermit withdrawn from a wicked world. It was amusingly unexpected to me and nothing more, but it must have appealed straight to that bruised and battered young soul. Still shrinking from his nearness, she had ended by listening to him with avidity. His deep murmuring voice soothed her, and she thought suddenly that there was peace and rest in the grave too. She heard him say, "Look at my sister. She isn't a bad woman by any means. She asks me here because it's right and proper, I suppose, but she has no use for me. There you have your shore people. I quite understand anybody crying. I would have been gone already, only, truth to say, I haven't any friends to go to," he added brusquely. "And you?" She made a slight negative sign. He must have been observing her, putting 2 and 2 together. After a pause he said simply, "When I first came here I thought you were governess to these girls. My sister didn't say a word about you to me." Then Flora spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Fyne is my best friend." "So she is mine," he said, without the slightest irony or bitterness, but added with conviction, "That shows you what life ashore is. Much better be out of it." As they were approaching the cottage he was heard again, as though a long silent walk had not intervened, "But anyhow I shan't ask her anything about you." He stopped short, and she went on alone. His last words had impressed her, Everything he had said seemed somehow to have a special meaning under its obvious conversational sense. Till she went in at the door of the cottage she felt his eyes resting on her. That is it. He had made himself felt. That girl was, one may say, washing about with slack limbs in the ugly surf of life, with no opportunity to strike out for herself, when suddenly she had been made to feel that there was somebody beside her in the bitter water. A most considerable moral event for her, whether she was aware of it or not. They met again at the 1 o'clock dinner. I am inclined to think that, being a healthy girl under her frail appearance, and fast walking and what I may call relief crying, there are many kinds of crying, making one hungry, she made a good meal. It was Captain Anthony who had no appetite. His sister commented on it in a curt business-like manner, and the eldest of his delightful nieces said mockingly, "You have been taking too much exercise this morning, Uncle Roderick." The mild Uncle Roderick turned upon her with a "What do you know about it, young lady?" so charged with suppressed savagery that the whole round table gave one gasp and went dumb for the rest of the meal. He took no notice whatever of Flora de Barral. I don't think it was from prudence or any calculated motive. I believe he was so full of her aspects that he did not want to look in her direction when there were other people to hamper his imagination. End of part 8. Part 9 of Chance by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 9. You understand, I am piecing here bits of disconnected statements. Next day, Flora saw him leaning over the field gate. When she told me this, I didn't, of course, ask her how it was she was there. Probably she could not have told me how it was she was there. The difficulty here is to keep steadily in view the then conditions of her existence, a combination of dreariness and horror. That hermit-like but not exactly misanthropic sailor was leaning over the gate moodily. When he saw the white-faced, restless Flora drifting like a lost thing along the road, he put his pipe in his pocket and called out, "Good morning, Miss Smith," in a tone of amazing happiness. She, with one foot in life and the other in a nightmare, was at the same time inert and unstable, and very much at the mercy of sudden impulses. She swerved, came distractedly right up to the gate, and looking straight into his eyes, "I am not Miss Smith. That is not my name. Don't call me by it." She was shaking as if in a passion. His eyes expressed nothing. He only unlatched the gate in silence, grasped her arm and drew her in, then closing it with a kick. "Not your name? That's all one to me. Your name's the least thing about you I care for." He was leading her firmly away from the gate, though she resisted slightly. There was a sort of joy in his eyes which frightened her. "You are not a princess in disguise," he said with an unexpected laugh she found blood-curdling. "And that's all I care for. You had better understand that I am not blind and not a fool. And then it's plain for even a fool to see that things have been going hard with you. You are on a lee shore and eating your heart out with worry." What seemed most awful to her was the elated light in his eyes, the rapacious smile that would come and go on his lips as if he were gloating over her misery. But her misery was his opportunity, and he rejoiced while the tenderest pity seemed to flood his whole being. He pointed out to her that she knew who he was. He was Mrs. Fyne's brother. And, well, if his sister was the best friend she had in the world, then, by Jove, it was about time somebody came along to look after her a little. Flora had tried more than once to free herself, but he tightened his grasp of her arm each time and even shook it a little without ceasing to speak. The nearness of his face intimidated her. He seemed striving to look her through. It was obvious the world had been using her ill. And even as he spoke with indignation, the very marks and stamp of this ill usage, of which he was so certain, seemed to add to the inexplicable attraction he felt for her person. It was not pity alone, I take it. It was something more spontaneous, perverse and exciting. It gave him the feeling that if only he could get hold of her, no woman would belong to him so completely as this woman. "Whatever your troubles," he said, "I am the man to take you away from them. That is, if you are not afraid. You told me you had no friends. Neither have I. Nobody ever cared for me as far as I can remember. Perhaps you could. Yes, I live on the sea. But who would you be parting from? No one. You have no one belonging to you." At this point she broke away from him and ran. He did not pursue her. The tall hedges tossing in the wind, the wide fields, the clouds driving over the sky, and the sky itself wheeled about her in masses of green and white and blue, as if the world were breaking up silently in a whirl, and her foot at the next step were bound to find the void. She reached the gate all right, got out, and once on the road discovered that she had not the courage to look back. The rest of that day she spent with the Fyne girls, who gave her to understand that she was a slow and unprofitable person. Long after tea, nearly at dusk, Captain Anthony, the son of the poet, appeared suddenly before her in the little garden in front of the cottage. They were alone for the moment. The wind had dropped. In the calm evening air the voices of Mrs. Fyne and the girls strolling aimlessly on the road could be heard. He said to her severely, "You have understood?" She looked at him in silence. "That I love you," he finished. She shook her head the least bit. "Don't you believe me?" he asked in a low, infuriated voice. "Nobody would love me," she answered in a very quiet tone. "Nobody could." He was dumb for a time, astonished beyond measure, as he well might have been. He doubted his ears. He was outraged. "Eh? What? Can't love you? What do you know about it? It's my affair, isn't it? You dare say that to a man who had just told you? You must be mad." "Very nearly," she said with the accent of pent-up sincerity, and even relieved because she was able to say something which she felt was true. For the last few days she had felt herself several times near that madness which is but an intolerable lucidity of apprehension. The clear voices of Mrs. Fyne and the girls were coming nearer, sounding affected in the peace of the passion-laden earth. He began storming at her hastily. "Nonsense! Nobody can. Indeed, pah! You'll have to be shown that somebody can." "I can." "Nobody." He made a contemptuous hissing noise. "More likely you can't. They have done something to you. Something's crushed your pluck. You can't face a man. That's what it is. What made you like this? Where do you come from? You have been put upon. The scoundrels, whoever they are, men or women, seem to have robbed you of your very name. You say you are not Miss Smith. Who are you then?" She did not answer. He muttered, "Not that I care," and fell silent, because the fatuous, self-confident chatter of the Fyne girls could be heard at the very gate. But they were not going to bed yet. They passed on. He waited a little in silence and immobility, then stamped his foot and lost control of himself. He growled at her in a savage passion. She felt certain that he was threatening her and calling her names. She was no stranger to abuse, as we know, but there seemed to be a particular kind of ferocity in this which was new to her. She began to tremble. The especially terrifying thing was that she could not make out the nature of these awful menaces and names. Not a word. Yet it was not the shrinking anguish of her other experiences of angry scenes. She made a mighty effort, though her knees were knocking together, and in an expiring voice demanded that he should let her go indoors. "Don't stop me. It's no use. It's no use," she repeated faintly, feeling an invincible obstinacy rising within her, yet without anger against that raging man. He became articulate suddenly and without raising his voice perfectly audible. "No use, no use. You dare stand here and tell me that. You white-faced wisp, you wreath of mist, you little ghost of all the sorrow in the world. You dare! Haven't I been looking at you? You are all eyes. What makes your cheeks always so white, as if you had seen something? Don't speak. I love it. No use. And you really think I can now go to sea for a year or more, to the other side of the world somewhere, leaving you behind? Why, you would vanish. What little there is of you. Some rough wind would blow you away altogether. You have no holding ground on earth. Well, then, trust yourself to me, to the sea, which is deep like your eyes." She said, "Impossible." He kept quiet for a while, then asked in a totally changed tone, a tone of gloomy curiosity: "You can't stand me then? Is that it?" "No," she said, more steady herself. "I am not thinking of you at all." The inane voices of the Fyne girls were heard over the sombre fields, calling to each other thin and clear. He muttered: "You could try to, unless you are thinking of somebody else." "Yes, I am thinking of somebody else, of someone who has nobody to think of him but me." His shadowy form stepped out of her way and suddenly leaned sideways against the wooden support of the porch. And as she stood still, surprised by this staggering movement, his voice spoke up in a tone quite strange to her. "Go in then. Go out of my sight. I thought you said nobody could love you." She was passing him when suddenly he struck her as so forlorn that she was inspired to say: "No one has ever loved me, not in that way, if that's what you mean. Nobody would." He detached himself brusquely from the post, and she did not shrink, but Mrs. Fyne and the girls were already at the gate. All he understood was that everything was not over yet. There was no time to lose. Mrs. Fyne and the girls had come in at the gate. He whispered "Wait" with such authority (he was the son of Carleon Anthony, the domestic autocrat) that it did arrest her for a moment, long enough to hear him say that he could not be left like this to puzzle over her nonsense all night. She was to slip down again into the garden later on, as soon as she could do so without being heard. He would be there waiting for her till daylight. She didn't think he could go to sleep, did she? And she had better come or... He broke off on an unfinished threat. She vanished into the unlighted cottage just as Mrs. Fyne came up to the porch. Nervous, holding her breath in the darkness of the living room, she heard her best friend say: "You ought to have joined us, Roderick." And then: "Have you seen Miss Smith anywhere?" Flora shuddered, expecting Anthony to break out into betraying imprecations on Miss Smith's head and cause a painful and humiliating explanation. She imagined him full of his mysterious ferocity. To her great surprise Anthony's voice sounded very much as usual, with perhaps a slight tinge of grimness. "Miss Smith! No, I've seen no Miss Smith." Mrs. Fyne seemed satisfied and not much concerned really. Flora, relieved, got clear away to her room upstairs and shutting her door, quietly dropped into a chair. She was used to reproaches, abuse, to all sorts of wicked ill usage, short of actual beating on her body. Otherwise inexplicable angers had cut and slashed and trampled down her youth without mercy, and mainly, it appeared, because she was the financier de Barral's daughter, and also condemned to a degrading sort of poverty through the action of treacherous men who had turned upon her father in his hour of need. And she thought with the tenderest possible affection of that upright figure buttoned up in a long frock coat, soft voiced, and having but little to say to his girl. She seemed to feel his hand closed round hers. On his flying visits to Brighton he would always walk hand in hand with her. People stared covertly at them. The band was playing, and there was the sea, the blue gaiety of the sea. They were quietly happy together. It was all over. An immense anguish of the present wrung her heart, and she nearly cried aloud. That dread of what was before her, which had been eating up her courage slowly in the course of odious years, flamed up into an access of panic, that sort of headlong panic which had already driven her out twice to the top of the cliff-like quarry. She jumped up, saying to herself, "Why not now, at once? Yes, I'll do it now, in the dark." The very horror of it seemed to give her additional resolution. She came down the staircase quietly, and only on the point of opening the door, and because of the discovery that it was unfastened, she remembered Captain Anthony's threat to stay in the garden all night. She hesitated. She did not understand the mood of that man clearly. He was violent, but she had gone beyond the point where things matter. What would he think of her coming down to him, as he would naturally suppose? And even that didn't matter. He could not despise her more than she despised herself. She must have been light-headed, because the thought came into her mind that should he get into ungovernable fury from disappointment and perchance strangle her, it would be as good a way to be done with it as any. "You had that thought?" I exclaimed in wonder. With downcast eyes, and speaking with an almost painstaking precision, her very lips, her red lips, seemed to move just enough to be heard and no more. She said that, yes, the thought came into her head. This makes one shudder at the mysterious ways girls acquire knowledge. For this was a thought, wild enough, I admit, but which could only have come from the depths of that sort of experience which she had not had, and went far beyond a young girl's possible conception of the strongest and most veiled of human emotions. "He was there, of course?" I said. Yes, he was there. She saw him on the path directly she stepped outside the porch. He was very still. It was as though he had been standing there with his face to the door for hours. Shaken up by the changing moods of passion and tenderness, he must have been ready for any extravagance of conduct. Knowing the profound silence each night brought to that nook of the country, I could imagine them having the feeling of being the only two people on the wide earth. A row of 6 or 7 lofty elms just across the road opposite the cottage made the night more obscure in that little garden. If these two could just make out each other, That was all." "Well, and were you very much terrified?" I asked. She made me wait a little before she said, raising her eyes: "He was gentleness itself. I noticed 3 abominable drink-sodden loafers, sallow and dirty, who had come to range themselves in a row within 10 feet of us, against the front of the public house. They stared at Flora de Barral's back with unseeing, mournful fixity. 'Let's move this way a little,' I proposed. She turned at once and we made a few paces. Not too far to take us out of sight of the hotel door, but very nearly. I could just keep my eyes on it. After all, I had not been so very long with the girl. If you were to disentangle the words we actually exchanged from my comments, you would see that they were not so very many, including everything she had so unexpectedly told me of her story. No, not so very many. And now it seemed as though there would be no more. No, I could expect no more. The confidence was wonderful enough in its nature as far as it went, and perhaps not to have been expected from any other girl under the sun. And I felt a little ashamed. The origin of our intimacy was too gruesome. It was as if listening to her I had taken advantage of having seen her poor, bewildered, scared soul without its veils. But I was curious too, or to render myself justice without false modesty, I was anxious to know a little more. I felt like a blackmailer all the same when I made my attempt with a light-hearted remark. "And so you gave up that walk you proposed to take?" "Yes, I gave up the walk," she said slowly before raising her downcast eyes. When she did so it was with an extraordinary effect. It was like catching sight of a piece of blue sky, of a stretch of open water. And for a moment I understood the desire of that man, to whom the sea and sky of his solitary life had appeared suddenly incomplete without that glance which seemed to belong to them both. He was not for nothing the son of a poet. I looked into those unabashed eyes while the girl went on, her demure appearance and precise tone changed to a very earnest expression. "Woman is various indeed. But I want you to understand, Mr." She had actually to think of my name, Mr. Marlow, "that I have written to Mrs. Fyne that I haven't been, that I have done nothing to make Captain Anthony behave to me as he had behaved. I haven't. It isn't my doing. It isn't my fault, if she likes to put it in that way. But she, with her ideas, ought to understand that I couldn't. I know she hates me now. I think she never liked me. I think nobody ever cared for me. I was told once nobody could care for me, and I think it is true. At any rate I can't forget it." Her abominable experience with the governess had implanted in her unlucky breast a lasting doubt, an ineradicable suspicion of herself and of others. I said: "Remember, Miss de Barral, that to be fair you must trust a man altogether or not at all." She dropped her eyes suddenly. I thought I heard a faint sigh. I tried to take a light tone again, and yet it seemed impossible to get off the ground which gave me my standing with her. "Mrs. Fyne is absurd. She's an excellent woman, but really you could not be expected to throw away your chance of life simply that she might cherish a good opinion of your memory. That would be excessive." "It was not of my life that I was thinking while Captain Anthony was speaking to me," said Flora de Barral with an effort. I told her that she was wrong then. She ought to have been thinking of her life, and not only of her life but of the life of the man who was speaking to her too. She let me finish, then shook her head impatiently. I mean death. Well, I said, when he stood before you there, outside the cottage, he really stood between you and that. I have it out of your own mouth. You can't deny it. If you will have it that he saved my life, then he has got it. It was not for me. Oh no. It was not for me that it was not fear. There," she finished petulantly, "and you may just as well know it." She hung her head and swung the parasol slightly to and fro. I thought a little. "Do you know French, Miss de Barral?" I asked. She made a sign with her head that she did, but without showing any surprise at the question and without ceasing to swing her parasol. "Well then, somehow or other I have the notion that Captain Anthony is what the French call un galant homme. I should like to think he is being treated as he deserves." The form of her lips, I could see them under the brim of her hat, was suddenly altered into a line of seriousness. The parasol stopped swinging. "I have given him everything he wanted. That's myself," she said, without a tremor and with a striking dignity of tone. Impressed by the manner and the directness of the words, I hesitated for a moment what to say, then made up my mind to clear up the point. "And you have got what you wanted? Is that it?" The daughter of the egregious financier de Barral did not answer at once this question going to the heart of things. Then raising her head and gazing wistfully across the street noisy with the endless transit of innumerable bargains, she said with intense gravity, "He has been most generous." I was pleased to hear these words. Not that I doubted the infatuation of Roderick Anthony, but I was pleased to hear something which proved that she was sensible and open to the sentiment of gratitude, which in this case was significant. In the face of man's desire a girl is excusable if she thinks herself priceless. I mean a girl of our civilization, which has established a dithyrambic phraseology for the expression of love. A man in love will accept any convention exalting the object of his passion, and in this direct way his passion itself. In what way the captain of the ship Ferndale gave proofs of lover-like lavishness I could not guess very well. But I was glad she was appreciative. It is lucky that small things please women, and it is not silly of them to be thus pleased. It is in small things that the deepest loyalty, that which they need most, the loyalty of the passing moment, is best expressed. She had remained thoughtful, letting her deep motionless eyes rest on the streaming jumble of traffic. Suddenly she said, "And I wanted to ask you. I was really glad when I saw you actually here. Who would have expected you here at this spot before this hotel? I certainly never. You see it meant a lot to me. You are the only person who knows for certain." "Knows what?" I said, not discovering at first what she had in her mind. Then I saw it. "Why can't you leave that alone?" I remonstrated, rather annoyed at the invidious position she was forcing on me in a sense. "It's true that I was the only person to see," I added, "but as it happens, after your mysterious disappearance I told the Fynes the story of our meeting." Her eyes raised to mine had an expression of dreamy, unfathomable candour, if I dare say so. And if you wonder what I mean, I can only say that I have seen the sea wear such an expression on one or two occasions shortly before sunrise on a calm, fresh day. She said as if meditating aloud that she supposed the Fynes were not likely to talk about that. She couldn't imagine any connection in which... Why should they? As her tone had become interrogatory I assented. "To be sure. There's no reason whatever," thinking to myself that they would be more likely indeed to keep quiet about it. They had other things to talk of. And then remembering little Fyne stuck upstairs for an unconscionable time, enough to blurt out everything he knew in his life, I reflected that he would assume naturally that Captain Anthony had nothing to learn from him about Flora de Barral. It had been up to now my assumption too. I saw my mistake. The sincerest of women will make no unnecessary confidences to a man, and this is as it should be. "No, no," I said reassuringly. "It's most unlikely. Are you much concerned?" "Well, you see, when I came down," she said again in that precise, demure tone, "when I came down into the garden, Captain Anthony misunderstood." "Of course he would. Men are so conceited," I said. I saw it well enough that he must have thought she had come down to him. What else could he have thought? And then he had been gentleness itself. A new experience for that poor delicate and yet so resisting creature. Gentleness in passion. What could have been more seductive to the scared, starved heart of that girl? Perhaps had he been violent she might have told him what she came down to keep was a tryst of death, not of love. It occurred to me as I looked at her, young, fragile in aspect and intensely alive in her quietness, that perhaps she did not know herself then what sort of tryst she was coming down to keep. She smiled faintly, almost awkwardly, as if she were totally unused to smiling, at my cheap jocularity. Then she said with that forced precision, a sort of conscious primness, "I didn't want him to know." I approved heartily. Quite right. Much better. Let him ever remain under his misapprehension, which was so much more flattering for him. I tried to keep it in the tone of comedy, but she was, I believe, too simple to understand my intention. She went on looking down. "Oh, you think so? When I saw you I didn't know why you were here. I was glad when you spoke to me because this is exactly what I wanted to ask you for. I wanted to ask you if you ever meet Captain Anthony by any chance anywhere (you are a sailor too, are you not?) that you would never mention, never that you had seen me over there." "My dear young lady," I cried, horror struck at the supposition. "Why should I? What makes you think I should dream of?" She had raised her head at my vehemence. She did not understand it. The world had treated her so dishonourably that she had no notion even of what mere decency of feeling is like. It was not her fault. Indeed, I don't know why she should have put her trust in anybody's promises. But I thought it would be better to promise, so I assured her that she could depend on my absolute silence. "I am not likely to ever set eyes on Captain Anthony," I added with conviction, as a further guarantee. She accepted my assurance in silence, without a sign. Her gravity had in it something acute, perhaps because of that chin. "While we were still looking at each other," she declared, "there's no deception in it really. I want you to believe that if I am here like this to day it is not from fear. It is not." "I quite understand," I said. But her firm yet self-conscious gaze became doubtful. "I do," I insisted. "I understand perfectly that it was not of death that you were afraid." She lowered her eyes slowly and I went on. "As to life, that's another thing. And I don't know that one ought to blame you very much, though it seemed rather an excessive step. I wonder now if it isn't the ugliness rather than the pain of the struggle which..." She shuddered visibly. "But I do blame myself," she exclaimed with feeling. "I am ashamed." And dropping her head she looked in a moment the very picture of remorse and shame. "Well, you will be going away from all its horrors," I said. "And surely you are not afraid of the sea. You are a sailor's granddaughter, I understand." She sighed deeply. She remembered her grandfather only a little. He was a clean shaven man with a ruddy complexion and long, perfectly white hair. He used to take her on his knee and, putting his face near hers, talk to her in loving whispers. If only he were alive now. She remained silent for a while. "Aren't you anxious to see the ship?" I asked. She lowered her head still more so that I could not see anything of her face. "I don't know," she murmured. I had already the suspicion that she did not know her own feelings. All this work of the merest chance had been so unexpected, so sudden. And she had nothing to fall back upon, no experience but such as to shake her belief in every human being. She was dreadfully and pitifully forlorn. It was almost in order to comfort my own depression that I remarked cheerfully: "Well, I know of somebody who must be growing extremely anxious to see you." "I am before my time," she confessed simply, rousing herself. "I had nothing to do, so I came out." I had the sudden vision of a shabby, lonely little room at the other end of the town. It had grown intolerable to her restlessness. The mere thought of it oppressed her. Flora de Barral was looking frankly at her chance confidant. "And I came this way," she went on. "I appointed the time myself yesterday, but Captain Anthony would not have minded. He told me he was going to look over some business papers till I came. The idea of the son of the poet, the rescuer of the most forlorn damsel of modern times, the man of violence, gentleness and generosity, sitting up to his neck in ship's accounts amused me. I am sure he would not have minded," I said smiling. But the girl's stare was sombre. Her thin white face seemed pathetically careworn. "I can hardly believe yet," she murmured anxiously. "It's quite real, never fear," I said encouragingly, but had to change my tone at once. "You had better go down that way a little," I directed her abruptly. I had seen Fyne come striding out of the hotel door. The intelligent girl, without staying to ask questions, walked away from me quietly down one street while I hurried on to meet Fyne coming up the other at his efficient pedestrian gait. My object was to stop him getting as far as the corner. He must have been thinking too hard to be aware of his surroundings. I put myself in his way and he nearly walked into me. "Hallo!" I said. His surprise was extreme. "You here! You don't mean to say you have been waiting for me?" I said negligently that I had been detained by unexpected business in the neighbourhood, and thus happened to catch sight of him coming out. He stared at me with solemn distraction, obviously thinking of something else. I suggested that he had better take the next cityward tramcar. He was inattentive, and I perceived that he was profoundly perturbed. As Miss de Barral (she had moved out of sight) could not possibly approach the hotel door as long as we remained where we were, I proposed that we should wait for the car on the other side of the street. He obeyed rather the slight touch on his arm than my words, and while we were crossing the wide roadway in the midst of the lumbering wheeled traffic, he exclaimed in his deep tone, I don't know which of these two is more mad than the other." "Really," I said, pulling him forward from under the noses of two enormous sleepy-headed cart horses. He skipped wildly out of the way and up on the curbstone with a purely instinctive precision. His mind had nothing to do with his movements. In the middle of his leap, and while in the act of sailing gravely through the air, he continued to relieve his outraged feelings. "You would never believe they are mad." I took care to place myself in such a position that to face me he had to turn his back on the hotel across the road. I believe he was glad I was there to talk to, but I thought there was some misapprehension in the first statement he shot out at me without loss of time, that Captain Anthony had been glad to see him. It was indeed difficult to believe that. Directly he opened the door his wife's sailor brother had positively shouted, "Oh, it's you! The very man I wanted to see." "I found him sitting there," went on Fyne impressively in his effortless, grave chest voice, "drafting his will." This was unexpected, but I preserved a non-committal attitude, knowing full well that our actions in themselves are neither mad nor sane. But I did not see what there was to be excited about. And Fyne was distinctly excited. I understood it better when I learned that the captain of the Ferndale wanted little Fyne to be one of the trustees. He was leaving everything to his wife. Naturally, a request which involved him into sanctioning in a way a proceeding which he had been sent by his wife to oppose must have appeared sufficiently mad to Fyne. "Me of all people in the world!" he repeated portentously, but I could see that he was frightened. Such want of tact. "He knew I came from his sister. You don't put a man into such an awkward position," complained Fyne. It made me speak much more strongly against all this very painful business than I would have had the heart to do otherwise. I pointed out to him concisely, and keeping my eyes on the door of the hotel, that he and his wife were the only bond with the land Captain Anthony had. Who else could he have asked? I explained to him that he was breaking this bond, declared Fyne solemnly, breaking it once for all. And for what? For what? He glared at me. I could perhaps have given him an inkling for what, but I said nothing. He started again. "My wife assures me that the girl does not love him a bit. She goes by that letter she received from her. There is a passage in it where she practically admits that she was quite unscrupulous in accepting this offer of marriage, but says to my wife that she supposes she, my wife, will not blame her, as it was in self-defence. My wife has her own ideas, but this is an outrageous misapprehension of her views. Outrageous." The good little man paused and then added weightily, "I didn't tell that to my brother-in-law. I mean my wife's views." "No," I said. "What would have been the good?" "It's positive infatuation," agreed little Fyne, in the tone as though he had made an awful discovery. "I have never seen anything so hopeless and inexplicable in my life. I felt quite frightened and sorry," he added, while I looked at him curiously, asking myself whether this excellent civil servant and notable pedestrian had felt the breath of a great and fatal love spell passing him by in the room of the East End Hotel. He did look for a moment as though he had seen a ghost, an other-world thing. But that look vanished instantaneously, and he nodded at me with mere exasperation at something quite of this world, whatever it was. "It's a bad business. My brother-in-law knows nothing of women," he cried with an air of profound, experienced wisdom. What he imagined he knew of women himself I can't tell. I did not know anything of the opportunities he might have had. But this is a subject which, if approached with undue solemnity, is apt to elude one's grasp entirely. No doubt Fyne knew something of a woman who was Captain Anthony's sister, but that admittedly had been a very solemn study. I smiled at him gently, and as if encouraged or provoked, he completed his thought rather explosively. "And that girl understands nothing. It's sheer lunacy." "I don't know," I said, "whether the circumstances of isolation at sea would be any alleviation to the danger. But it's certain that they shall have the opportunity to learn everything about each other in a lonely tete a tete." "But dash it all," he cried in hollow accents, which at the same time had the tone of bitter irony, I had never before heard a sound so quaintly ugly and almost horrible. "You forget Mr. Smith." "What Mr. Smith?" I asked innocently. Fyne made an extraordinary Simonesque grimace. I believe it was quite involuntary. But you know that a grave, much lined, shaven countenance, when distorted in an unusual way, is extremely ape-like. It was a surprising sight, and rendered me not only speechless but stopped the progress of my thought completely. I must have presented a remarkably imbecile appearance. My brother in law considered it amusing to chaff me about us introducing the girl as Miss Smith," said Fyne, going surly in a moment. "He said that perhaps if he had heard her real name from the first it might have restrained him. As it was, he made the discovery too late. Asked me to tell Zoe this together with a lot more nonsense." Fyne gave me the impression of having escaped from a man inspired by a grimly playful ebullition of high spirits. It must have been most distasteful to him, and his solemnity got damaged somehow in the process, I perceived. There were holes in it through which I could see a new, an unknown Fyne. "You wouldn't believe it," he went on, "but she looks upon her father exclusively as a victim. I don't know," he burst out suddenly through an enormous rent in his solemnity, "if she thinks him absolutely a saint, but she certainly imagines him to be a martyr. It is one of the advantages of that magnificent invention, the prison, that you may forget people which are put there as though they were dead. One needn't worry about them. Nothing can happen to them that you can help. They can do nothing which might possibly matter to anybody. They come out of it though, but that seems hardly an advantage to themselves or anyone else. I had completely forgotten the financier de Barral. The girl for me was an orphan." But now I perceived suddenly the force of Fyne's qualifying statement. To a certain extent it would have been infinitely more kind all round for the law to have shot, beheaded, strangled or otherwise destroyed this absurd de Barral, who was a danger to a moral world inhabited by a credulous multitude not fit to take care of itself. But I observed to Fyne that however insane was the view she held, one could not declare the girl mad on that account. "So she thinks of her father, does she? I suppose she would appear to us saner if she thought only of herself. I am positive," Fyne said earnestly, "that she went and made desperate eyes at Anthony." "Oh come," I interrupted. "You haven't seen her make eyes. You don't know the colour of her eyes." "Very well, it don't matter. But it could hardly have come to that if she hadn't. It's all one though. I tell you she has led him on, or accepted him if you like, simply because she was thinking of her father. She doesn't care a bit about Anthony, I believe. She cares for no one. Never cared for anyone. Ask Zoe. For myself I don't blame her," added Fyne, giving me another view of unsuspected things through the rags and tatters of his damaged solemnity. "No, by heavens, I don't blame her, the poor devil." I agreed with him silently. I suppose affections are, in a sense, to be learned. If there exists a native spark of love in all of us, it must be fanned while we are young. Hers, if she ever had it, had been drenched in as ugly a lot of corrosive liquid as could be imagined. But I was surprised at Fyne obscurely feeling this. "She loves no one except that preposterous advertising shark," he pursued venomously, but in a more deliberate manner. "And Anthony knows it." "Does he?" I said doubtfully. "She's quite capable of having told him herself," affirmed Fyne with amazing insight. "But whether or no, I've told him." "You did? From Mrs. Fyne, of course." Fyne only blinked owlishly at this piece of my insight. "And how did Captain Anthony receive this interesting information?" I asked further. "Most improperly," said Fyne, who really was in a state in which he didn't mind what he blurted out. "He isn't himself. He begged me to tell his sister that he offered no remarks on her conduct. Very improper and inconsequent," he said. I was tired of this wrangling. I told him I made allowances for the state of excitement he was in. "You know, Fyne," I said, "a man in jail seems to me such an incredible, cruel, nightmarish sort of thing that I can hardly believe in his existence. Certainly not in relation to any other existences." "But dash it all," cried Fyne, "he isn't shut up for life. They're going to let him out. He's coming out. That's the whole trouble. What is he coming out to, I want to know? It seems a more cruel business than the shutting him up was. This has been the worry for weeks. Do you see now? I saw all sorts of things. Immediately before me I saw the excitement of little Fyne, mere food for wonder. Further off, in a sort of gloom and beyond the light of day and the movement of the street, I saw the figure of a man, stiff like a ramrod, moving with small steps, a slight girlish figure by his side. And the gloom was like the gloom of villainous slums, of misery, of wretchedness, of a starved and degraded existence. It was a relief that I could see only their shabby, hopeless backs. He was an awful ghost, but indeed to call him a ghost was only a refinement of polite speech, and a manner of concealing one's terror of such things. Prisons are wonderful contrivances, shut open, very neat, shut open, and out comes some sort of corpse to wander awfully in a world in which it has no possible connections and carrying with it the appalling tainted atmosphere of its silent abode. Marvellous arrangement. It works automatically, and when you look at it the perfection makes you sick, which for a mere mechanism is no mean triumph. Sick and scared. It had nearly scared that poor girl to her death. Fancy having to take such a thing by the hand. Now I understood the remorseful strain I had detected in her speeches. "By Jove," I said, "they are about to let him out. I never thought of that." Fyne was contemptuous either of me or of things at large. "You didn't suppose he was to be kept in jail for life?" At that moment I caught sight of Flora de Barral at the junction of the two streets. Then some vehicles, following each other in quick succession, hid from my sight the black, slight figure with just a touch of colour in her hat. She was walking slowly, and it might have been caution or reluctance. While listening to Fyne I stared hard past his shoulder, trying to catch sight of her again. He was going on with positive heat, the rags of his solemnity dropping off him at every second sentence. That was just it. His wife and he had been perfectly aware of it. Of course. the girl never talked of her father with Mrs. Fyne. I suppose with her theory of innocence she found it difficult. But she must have been thinking of it day and night. What to do with him? Where to go? How to keep body and soul together? He had never made any friends. The only relations were the atrocious East End cousins. We know what they were. Nothing but wretchedness, whichever way she turned in an unjust and prejudiced world. And to look at him helplessly she felt would be too much for her. I won't say I was thinking these thoughts. It was not necessary. This complete knowledge was in my head while I stared hard across the wide road, so hard that I failed to hear little Fyne till he raised his deep voice indignantly. "I don't blame the girl," he was saying. "He is infatuated with her. Anybody can see that. Why she should have got such a hold on him I can't understand. She said yes to him only for the sake of that fatuous, swindling father of hers. It's perfectly plain if one thinks it over a moment. One needn't even think of it. We have it under her own hand. In that letter to my wife she says she has acted unscrupulously. She has owned up then, for what else can it mean, I should like to know? And so they are to be married before that old idiot comes out." "He will be surprised," commented Fyne suddenly in a strangely malignant tone. "He shall be met at the jail door by a Mrs. Anthony, a Mrs. Captain Anthony. Very pleasant for Zoe. And for all I know my brother-in-law means to turn up dutifully too. A little family event. It's extremely pleasant to think of. Delightful. A charming family party. We three against the world and all that sort of thing. And what for? For a girl who doesn't care twopence for him." The demon of bitterness had entered into little Fyne. He amazed me as though he had changed his skin from white to black. It was quite as wonderful, and he kept it up too. Luckily there are some advantages in the profession of a sailor. As long as they defy the world away at sea somewhere 18,000 miles from here, I don't mind so much. I wonder what that interesting old party will say. He will have another surprise. They mean to drag him along with them on board the ship straight away. Rescue work. Just think of Roderick Anthony, the son of a gentleman, after all." He gave me a little shock. I thought he was going to say the son of the poet, as usual. But his mind was not running on such vanities now. His unspoken thought must have gone on, and uncle of my girls. I suspect that he had been roughly handled by Captain Anthony up there. And the resentment gave a tremendous fillip to the slow play of his wits. Those men of sober fancy, when anything rouses their imaginative faculty, are very thorough. "Just think," he cried, "the three of them crowded into a four-wheeler, and Anthony sitting deferentially opposite that astonished old jailbird." The good little man laughed. An improper sound it was to come from his manly chest. And what made it worse was the thought that for the least thing, by a mere hair's breadth, he might have taken this affair sentimentally. But clearly Anthony was no diplomatist. His brother-in-law must have appeared to him, to use the language of shore people, a perfect Philistine with a heart like a flint. What Fyne precisely meant by wrangling I don't know, but I had no doubt that these two had wrangled to a profoundly disturbing extent. How much the other was affected I could not even imagine. But the man before me was quite amazingly upset. "In a four-wheeler! Take him on board," I muttered, startled by the change in Fyne. "That's the plan, nothing less. If I am to believe what I have been told, his feet will scarcely touch the ground between the prison gates and the deck of that ship." The transformed Fyne spoke in a forcibly lowered tone which I heard without difficulty. The rumbling composite noises of the street were hushed for a moment during one of those sudden breaks in the traffic, as if the stream of commerce had dried up at its source. Having an unobstructed view past Fyne's shoulder I was astonished to see that the girl was still there. I thought she had gone up long before. But there was her black, slender figure, her white face under the roses of her hat. She stood on the edge of the pavement as people stand on the bank of a stream, very still, as if waiting, or as if unconscious of where she was. The three dismal, sodden loafers (I could see them too, they hadn't budged an inch) seemed to me to be watching her, which was horrible. Meantime Fyne was telling me rather remarkable things for him. He declared first it was a mercy in a sense. Then he asked me if it were not real madness to saddle one's existence with such a perpetual reminder. The daily existence, the isolated sea-bound existence, to bring such an additional strain into the solitude already trying enough for two people, was the craziest thing. Undesirable relations were bad enough on shore. One could cut them or at least forget their existence now and then. He himself was preparing to forget his brother-in-law's existence as much as possible. That was the general sense of his remarks, not his exact words. I thought that his wife's brother's existence had never been very embarrassing to him, but that now of course he would have to abstain from his allusions to the son of the poet, you know. I said yes, yes, in the pauses because I did not want him to turn round. And all the time I was watching the girl intently. I thought I knew now what she meant with her "he was most generous." Yes. Generosity of character may carry a man through any situation. But why didn't she go then to her generous man? Why stand there as if clinging to this solid earth which she surely hated as one must hate the place where one has been tormented, hopeless, unhappy? Suddenly she stirred. Was she going to cross over? No. She turned and began to walk slowly close to the curbstone, reminding me of the time when I discovered her walking near the edge of a 90-foot sheer drop. It was the same impression, the same carriage, straight, slim, with rigid head, and the two hands hanging lightly clasped in front. Only now a small sunshade was dangling from them. I saw something fateful in that deliberate pacing towards the inconspicuous door with the words "Hotel Entrance" on the glass panels. End of part 9. Part 11 of Chance by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 11. The surprise, it is easy to understand, would arise from the inability to interpret aright the signs which experience, a thing mysterious in itself, makes to our understanding and emotions. For it is never more than that. Our experience never gets into our blood and bones. It always remains outside of us. That's why we look with wonder at the past. And this persists even when from practice and through growing callousness of fibre we come to the point when nothing that we meet in that rapid blinking stumble across a flick of sunshine which our life is, nothing, I say, which we run against surprises us any more. Not at the time, I mean. If, later on, we recover the faculty with some such exclamation, Well, well, I'll be hanged if I ever. It is probably because this very thing that there should be a past to look back upon, other people's, is very astounding in itself, when one has the time, a fleeting and immense instant, to think of it. I was on the point of interrupting Marlow when he stopped of himself, his eyes fixed on vacancy, or perhaps, I wouldn't be too hard on him, on a vision. He has the habit, or say the fault, of defective mantelpiece clocks, of suddenly stopping in the very fulness of the tick. If you have ever lived with a clock afflicted with that perversity you know how vexing it is, such a stoppage. I was vexed with Marlow. He was smiling faintly while I waited. He even laughed a little. And then I said acidly: "Am I to understand that you have ferreted out something comic in the history of Flora de Barral?" "Comic!" he exclaimed. "No! What makes you say?" "Oh, I laughed, did I? But don't you know that people laugh at absurdities that are very far from being comic? Didn't you read the latest books about laughter written by philosophers, psychologists? There is a lot of them." "I dare say there has been a lot of nonsense written about laughter. And tears too, for that matter," I said impatiently. "They say," pursued the unabashed Marlow, "that we laugh from a sense of superiority. Therefore observe, simplicity, honesty, warmth of feeling, delicacy of heart and of conduct, self-confidence, magnanimity, are laughed at, because the presence of these traits in a man's character often puts him into difficult, cruel or absurd situations, and makes us, the majority, who are fairly free as a rule from these peculiarities, feel pleasantly superior." "Speak for yourself," I said. "But have you discovered all these fine things in the story? Or has Mr. Powell discovered them to you in his artless talk? Have you two been having good healthy laughs together? Come, are your sides aching yet, Marlow?" Marlow took no offence at my banter. He was quite serious. "I should not like to say offhand how much of that there was," he pursued with amusing caution. "But there was a situation tense enough for the signs of it to give many surprises to Mr. Powell, neither of them shocking in itself, but with a cumulative effect which made the whole unforgettable in the detail of its progress. And the first surprise came very soon, when the explosives to which he owed his sudden chance of engagement, dynamite in cases and blasting powder in barrels, taken on board, main hatch battened for sea, cook restored to his function in the galley, anchor fished, and the tug ahead rounding the South Foreland, and with the sun sinking clear and red down the purple vista of the Channel, he went on the poop, on duty, it is true, but with time to take the first freer breath in the busy day of departure. The pilot was still on board, who gave him first a silent glance, and then passed an insignificant remark before resuming his lounging to and fro between the steering wheel and the binnacle. Powell took his station modestly at the break of the poop. He had noticed across the skylight a head in a grey cap, but when, after a time, he crossed over to the other side of the deck, he discovered that it was not the captain's head at all. He became aware of grey hairs curling over the nape of the neck. How could he have made that mistake? But on board ship, away from the land, one does not expect to come upon a stranger. Powell walked past the man. A thin, somewhat sunken face with a tightly closed mouth stared at the distant French coast, vague like a suggestion of solid darkness, lying abeam beyond the evening light reflected from the level waters, themselves growing more sombre than the sky. A stair across which Powell had to pass, and did pass with a quick side glance, noting its immovable stillness. His passage disturbed those eyes no more than if he had been as immaterial as a ghost. And this failure of his person in producing an impression affected him strangely. Who could that old man be? He was so curious that he even ventured to ask the pilot in a low voice. The pilot turned out to be a good-natured specimen of his kind, condescending, sententious. He had been down to his meals in the main cabin and had something to impart. "That? Queer fish, eh? Mrs. Anthony's father. I've been introduced to him in the cabin at breakfast time. Name of Smith. Wonder if he has all his wits about him. They take him about with them, it seems. Don't look very happy, eh?" Then, changing his tone abruptly, he desired Powell to get all hands on deck and make sail on the ship. "I shall be leaving you in half an hour. You'll have plenty of time to find out all about the old gent," he added with a thick laugh. In the secret emotion of giving his first order as a fully responsible officer, young Powell forgot the very existence of that old man in a moment. The following days, in the interest of getting in touch with the ship, with the men in her, with his duties, in the rather anxious period of settling down, his curiosity slumbered. For of course the pilot's few words had not extinguished it. This settling down was made easy for him by the friendly character of his immediate superior, the chief. Powell could not defend himself from some sympathy for that thick, bald man, comically shaped, with his crimson complexion, and something pathetic in the rolling of his very movable black eyes in an apparently immovable head, who was so tactfully ready to take his competency for granted. There can be nothing more reassuring to a young man tackling his life's work for the first time. Mr. Powell, his mind at ease about himself, had time to observe the people around with friendly interest. Very early in the beginning of the passage he had discovered, with some amusement, that the marriage of Captain Anthony was resented by those to whom Powell, conscious of being looked upon as something of an outsider, referred in his mind as the old lot. They had the funny, regretful glances, intonations, nods of men who had seen other, better times. What difference it could have made to the boatswain and the carpenter, Powell could not very well understand. Yet these two pulled long faces and even gave hostile glances to the poop. The cook and the steward might have been more directly concerned, but the steward used to remark on occasion, "Oh, she gives no extra trouble," with scrupulous fairness of the most gloomy kind. He was rather a silent man, with a great sense of his personal worth, which made his speeches guarded. The cook, a neat man with fair side whiskers, who had been only 3 years in the ship, seemed the least concerned. He was even known to have inquired once or twice as to the success of some of his dishes with the captain's wife. This was considered a sort of disloyal falling away from the ruling feeling. The mate's annoyance was yet the easiest to understand, as he let it out to Powell before the first week of the passage was over. "You can't expect me to be pleased at being chucked out of the saloon, as if I weren't good enough to sit down to meat with that woman." But he hastened to add, "Don't you think I'm blaming the captain. He isn't a man to be found fault with. You, Mr. Powell, are too young yet to understand such matters." Some considerable time afterwards, at the end of a conversation of that aggrieved sort, he enlarged a little more by repeating, "Yes, you are too young to understand these things. I don't say you haven't plenty of sense. You are doing very well here. Jolly sight better than I expected, though I liked your looks from the first." It was in the trade winds at night under a velvety bespangled sky, a great multitude of stars watching the shadows of the sea gleaming mysteriously in the wake of the ship, while the leisurely swishing of the water to leeward was like a drowsy comment on her progress. Mr. Powell expressed his satisfaction by a half bashful laugh. The mate mused on: "And of course you haven't known the ship as she used to be. She was more than a home to a man. She was not like any other ship. And Captain Anthony was not like any other master to sail with. Neither is she now. But before one never had a care in the world as to her, as to him too. No, indeed, there was never anything to worry about. Young Powell couldn't see what there was to worry about even then. The serenity of the peaceful night seemed as vast as all space, and as enduring as eternity itself. It's true, the sea is an uncertain element, but no sailor remembers this in the presence of its bewitching power any more than a lover ever thinks of the proverbial inconstancy of women. And Mr. Powell, being young, thought naively that the captain being married, there could be no occasion for anxiety as to his condition. I suppose that to him life, perhaps not so much his own as that of others, was something still in the nature of a fairy tale with a "they lived happily ever after" termination. We are the creatures of our light literature much more than is generally suspected in a world which prides itself on being scientific and practical, and in possession of incontrovertible theories. Powell felt in that way the more because the captain of a ship at sea is a remote, inaccessible creature, something like a prince of a fairy tale, alone of his kind, depending on nobody, not to be called to account except by powers practically invisible and so distant that they might well be looked upon as supernatural for all that the rest of the crew knows of them, as a rule. So he did not understand the aggrieved attitude of the mate, or rather he understood it obscurely as a result of simple causes which did not seem to him adequate. He would have dismissed all this out of his mind with a contemptuous "What the devil do I care?" if the captain's wife herself had not been so young. To see her the first time had been something of a shock to him. He had some preconceived ideas as to captains' wives which, while he did not believe the testimony of his eyes, made him open them very wide. He had stared till the captain's wife noticed it plainly and turned her face away. Captain's wife! That girl covered with rugs in a long chair. Captain's! He gasped mentally. It had never occurred to him that a captain's wife could be anything but a woman to be described as stout or thin, as jolly or crabbed, but always mature and, even in comparison with his own years, frankly old. But this! It was a sort of moral upset, as though he had discovered a case of abduction or something as surprising as that. You understand that nothing is more disturbing than the upsetting of a preconceived idea. Each of us arranges the world according to his own notion of the fitness of things. To behold a girl where your average mediocre imagination had placed a comparatively old woman may easily become one of the strongest shocks. Marlow paused, smiling to himself. Powell remained impressed after all these years by the very recollection. He continued in a voice, amused perhaps but not mocking. He said to me only the other day with something like the first awe of that discovery lingering in his tone, he said to me: "Why, she seemed so young, so girlish, that I looked round for some woman which would be the captain's wife, though of course I knew there was no other woman on board that voyage. The voyage before, it seems, there had been the steward's wife to act as maid to Mrs. Anthony, but she was not taken that time for some reason he didn't know. Mrs. Anthony. If it hadn't been the captain's wife he would have referred to her mentally as a kid, he said. I suppose there must be a sort of divinity hedging in a captain's wife, however incredible, which prevented him applying to her that contemptuous definition in the secret of his thoughts. I asked him when this had happened, and he told me that it was 3 days after parting from the tug, just outside the Channel, to be precise. A head wind had set in with unpleasant damp weather. He had come up to leeward of the poop, still feeling very much of a stranger, and an untried officer, at 6 in the evening to take his watch. To see her was quite as unexpected as seeing a vision. When she turned away her head he recollected himself and dropped his eyes. What he could see then was only close to the long chair on which she reclined, a pair of long thin legs ending in black cloth boots tucked in close to the skylight seat. Whence he concluded that the old gentleman, who wore a grey cap like the captain's, was sitting by her, his daughter. In his first astonishment he had stopped dead short, with the consequence that now he felt very much abashed at having betrayed his surprise. But he couldn't very well turn tail and bolt off the poop. He had come there on duty, so, still with downcast eyes, he made his way past them. Only when he got as far as the wheel grating did he look up. She was hidden from him by the back of her deck chair, but he had the view of the owner of the thin, aged legs seated on the skylight, his clean shaved cheek, his thin compressed mouth with a hollow in each corner, the sparse grey locks escaping from under the tweed cap and curling slightly on the collar of the coat. He leaned forward a little over Mrs. Anthony, but they were not talking. Captain Anthony, walking with a springy hurried gait on the other side of the poop, from end to end, gazed straight before him. Young Powell might have thought that his captain was not aware of his presence either. However, he knew better, and for that reason spent a most uncomfortable hour motionless by the compass before his captain stopped in his swift pacing and with an almost visible effort made some remark to him about the weather in a low voice. Before Powell, who was startled, could find a word of answer, the captain swung off again on his endless tramp with a fixed gaze. And till the supper bell rang silence dwelt over that poop like an evil spell. The captain walked up and down, looking straight before him. The helmsman steered, looking upwards at the sails. The old gent on the skylight looked down on his daughter. And Mr. Powell confessed to me that he didn't know where to look, feeling as though he had blundered in where he had no business, which was absurd. At last he fastened his eyes on the compass card, took refuge in spirit inside the binnacle. He felt chilled more than he should have been by the chilly dusk falling on the muddy green sea of the surroundings from a smoothly clouded sky. A fitful wind swept the cheerless waste, and the ship, hauled up so close as to check her way, seemed to progress by languid fits and starts against the short seas which swept along her sides with a snarling sound. Young Powell thought that this was the dreariest evening aspect of the sea he had ever seen. He was glad when the other occupants of the poop left it at the sound of the bell. The captain first, with a sudden swerve in his walk towards the companion, and not even looking once towards his wife and his wife's father. Those two got up and moved towards the companion, the old gent very erect, his thin locks stirring gently about the nape of his neck, and carrying the rugs over his arm. The girl who was Mrs. Anthony went down first. The murky twilight had settled in deep shadow on her face. She looked at Mr. Powell in passing. He thought that she was very pale, cold perhaps. The old gent stopped a moment, thin and stiff, before the young man, and in a voice which was low but distinct enough and without any particular accent, not even of inquiry, he said: "You are the new second officer, I believe." Mr. Powell answered in the affirmative, wondering if this were a friendly overture. He had noticed that Mr. Smith's eyes had a soft inward look, as though he had disliked or disdained his surroundings. The captain's wife had disappeared then down the companion stairs. Mr. Smith said "Ah," and waited a little longer to put another question in his incurious voice. "And did you know the man who was here before you?" "No," said young Powell. "I didn't know anybody belonging to this ship before I joined." "He was much older than you, twice your age, perhaps more. His hair was iron grey. Yes, certainly more." The low repressed voice paused, but the old man did not move away. He added: "Isn't it unusual?" Mr. Powell was surprised not only by being engaged in conversation but also by its character. It might have been the suggestion of the word uttered by this old man, but it was distinctly at that moment that he became aware of something unusual, not only in this encounter but generally around him, about everybody, in the atmosphere. The very sea, with short flashes of foam bursting out here and there in the gloomy distances, the unchangeable safe sea sheltering a man from all passions except his own anger, seemed queer to the quick glance he threw to windward, where the already effaced horizon traced no reassuring limit to the eye. In the expiring diffused twilight, and before the clouded night dropped its mysterious veil, it was the immensity of space made visible, almost palpable. Young Powell felt it. He felt it in the sudden sense of his isolation. The trustworthy, powerful ship of his first acquaintance reduced to a speck, to something almost undistinguishable, the mere support for the soles of his 2 feet before that unexpected old man, becoming so suddenly articulate in a darkening universe. It took him a moment or so to seize the drift of the question. He repeated slowly: "Unusual. Oh, you mean for an elderly man to be the second of a ship. I don't know. There are a good many of us who don't get on. He didn't get on, I suppose." The other, his head bowed a little, had the air of listening with acute attention. "And now he has been taken to the hospital," he said. "I believe so. Yes. I remember Captain Anthony saying so in the shipping office." "Possibly about to die," went on the old man in his careful deliberate tone. "And perhaps glad enough to die." Mr. Powell was young enough to be startled at the suggestion, which sounded confidential and blood curdling in the dusk. He said sharply that it was not very likely, as if defending the absent victim of the accident from an unkind aspersion. He felt, in fact, indignant. The other emitted a short stifled laugh of a conciliatory nature. The second bell rang under the poop. He made a movement at the sound, but lingered. "What I said was not meant seriously," he murmured, with that strange air of fearing to be overheard. "Not in this case. I know the man." The occasion, or rather the want of occasion, for this conversation had sharpened the perceptions of the unsophisticated second officer of the Ferndale. He was alive to the slightest shade of tone, and felt as if this "I know the man" should have been followed by a "he was no friend of mine." But after the shortest possible break the old gentleman continued to murmur distinctly and evenly: "Whereas you have never seen him. Nevertheless, when you have gone through as many years as I have, you will understand how an event putting an end to one's existence may not be altogether unwelcome. Of course there are stupid accidents, and even then one needn't be very angry. What is it to be deprived of life? It's soon done. But what would you think of the feelings of a man who should have had his life stolen from him? Cheated out of it, I say." He ceased abruptly, and remained still long enough for the astonished Powell to stammer out an indistinct: "What do you mean? I don't understand." Then with a low good night glided a few steps and sank through the shadow of the companion into the lamplight below, which did not reach higher than the turn of the staircase. The strange words, the cautious tone, the whole person, left a strong uneasiness in the mind of Mr. Powell. He started walking the poop in great mental confusion. He felt all adrift. This was funny talk, and no mistake. And this cautious low tone, as though he were watched by someone, was more than funny. The young second officer hesitated to break the established rule of every ship's discipline, but at last he could not resist the temptation of getting hold of some other human being, and spoke to the man at the wheel. "Did you hear what this gentleman was saying to me?" "No, sir," answered the sailor quietly. Then, encouraged by this evidence of laxity in his officer, made bold to add: "A queer fish, sir." This was tentative, and Mr. Powell, busy with his own view, not saying anything, he ventured further: "They are more like passengers. One sees some queer passengers." "Who are like passengers?" asked Powell gruffly. "Why, these two, sir." CHAPTER 3 DEVOTED SERVANTS AND THE LIGHT OF A FLARE. Young Powell thought to himself: "The men too are noticing it." Indeed, the captain's behaviour to his wife and to his wife's father was noticeable enough. It was as if they had been a pair of not very congenial passengers. But perhaps it was not always like that. The captain might have been put out by something. When the aggrieved Franklin came on deck Mr. Powell made a remark to that effect, for his curiosity was aroused. The mate grumbled: "Seems to you put out, eh?" He buttoned his thick jacket up to the throat, and only then added a gloomy "Aye, likely enough," which discouraged further conversation. But no encouragement would have induced the newly joined second mate to enter the way of confidences. His was an instinctive prudence. Powell did not know why it was he had resolved to keep his own counsel as to his colloquy with Mr. Smith, but his curiosity did not slumber. Sometimes afterwards, again at the relief of watches, in the course of a little talk, he mentioned Mrs. Anthony's father quite casually, and tried to find out from the mate who he was. It would take a clever man to find that out, as things are on board now, Mr. Franklin said, unexpectedly communicative. The first I saw of him was when she brought him alongside in a four-wheeler one morning about 11:30. The captain had come on board early and was down in the cabin that had been fitted out for him. Did I tell you that if you want the captain for anything you must stamp on the port side of the deck? That's so. This ship is not only unlike what she used to be, but she is like no other ship, anyhow. Did you ever hear of the captain's room being on the port side? Both of them stern cabins have been fitted up afresh like a blessed palace. A gang of people from some tip-top West End house were fussing here on board with hangings and furniture for a fortnight, as if the Queen were coming with us. Of course the starboard cabin is the bedroom one, but the poor captain hangs out to port on a couch, so that in case we want him on deck at night Mrs. Anthony should not be startled. Nervous! Phoo! A woman who marries a sailor and makes up her mind to come to sea should have no blamed jumpiness about her, I say. But never mind. Directly the old cab pointed round the corner of the warehouse I called out to the captain that his lady was coming aboard. He answered me, but as I didn't see him coming I went down the gangway myself to help her alight. She jumps out excitedly without touching my arm or as much as saying thank you or good morning or anything. Turns back to the cab and then that old joker comes out slowly. I hadn't noticed him inside. I hadn't expected to see anybody. It gave me a start. She says, "My father, Mr. Franklin." He was staring at me like an owl. "How do you do, sir?" says I. Both of them looked funny. It was as if something had happened to them on the way. Neither of them moved, and I stood by waiting. The captain showed himself on the poop, and I saw him at the side looking over, and then he disappeared. On the way to meet them on shore I expected, but he just went down below again. So, not seeing him, I said, "Let me help you on board, sir." "On board," says he in a silly fashion. "On board." "It's not a very good ladder, but it's quite firm," says I, as he seemed to be afraid of it. And he didn't look a broken down old man either. You can see yourself what he is, straight as a poker, and life enough in him yet. But he made no move, and I began to feel foolish. Then she comes forward. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Franklin, I'll help my father up." Flabbergasted me to be choked off like this, pushed in between him and me without as much as a look my way, so of course I dropped it. What do you think? I fell back. I would have gone up on board at once and left them on the quay to come up or stay there till next week, only they were blocking the way. I couldn't very well shove them on one side. Devil only knows what was up between them. There she was, pale as death, talking to him very fast. He got as red as a turkey cock. Dash me if he didn't. A bad-tempered old bloke, I can tell you. And a bad lot, too. Never mind. I couldn't hear what she was saying to him, but she put force enough into it to shake her. It seemed, mind, that he didn't want to go on board. Of course it couldn't have been that. I know better. Well, she took him by the arm, above the elbow, as if to lead him, or push him rather. I was standing not quite 10 feet off. Why should I have gone away? I was anxious to get back on board as soon as they would let me. I didn't want to overhear her blamed whispering either. But I couldn't stay there for ever, so I made a move to get past them if I could. And that's how I heard a few words. It was the old chap, something nasty about being under the heel of somebody or other. Then he says, "I don't want this sacrifice." What it meant I can't tell. It was a quarrel, of that I am certain. She looks over her shoulder and sees me pretty close to them. I don't know what she found to say into his ear, but he gave way suddenly. He looked round at me too, and they went up together so quickly then that when I got on the quarter deck I was only in time to see the inner door of the passage close after them. Queer, eh? But if it were only queerness one wouldn't mind. Some luggage in new trunks came on board in the afternoon. We undocked at midnight. And may I be hanged if I know who or what he was or is. I haven't been able to find out. No, I don't know. He may have been anything. All I know is that once years ago, when I went to see the Derby with a friend, I saw a pea and thimble cap who looked just like that old mystery father out of a cab. All this the goggle-eyed mate had said in a resentful and melancholy voice, with pauses, to the gentle murmur of the sea. It was for him a bitter sort of pleasure to have a fresh pair of ears, a newcomer, to whom he could repeat all these matters of grief and suspicion talked over endlessly by the band of Captain Anthony's faithful subordinates. It was evidently so refreshing to his worried spirit that it made him forget the advisability of a little caution with a complete stranger. But really with Mr. Powell there was no danger. Amused at first at these plaints, he provoked them for fun. Afterwards, turning them over in his mind, he became impressed. And as the impression grew stronger with the days, his resolution to keep it to himself grew stronger too. What made it all the easier to keep, I mean the resolution, was that Powell's sentiment of amused surprise at what struck him at first as mere absurdity was not unmingled with indignation. And his years were too few, his position too novel, his reliance on his own opinion not yet firm enough to allow him to express it with any effect. And then what would have been the use anyhow? And where was the necessity? But this thing, familiar and mysterious at the same time, occupied his imagination. The solitude of the sea intensifies the thoughts and the facts of one's experience which seems to lie at the very centre of the world, as the ship which carries one always remains the centre figure of the round horizon. He viewed the apoplectic, goggle-eyed mate and the saturnine, heavy-eyed steward as the victims of a peculiar and secret form of lunacy which poisoned their lives. But he did not give them his sympathy on that account. No. That strange affliction awakened in him a sort of suspicious wonder. Once, and it was at night again, for the officers of the Ferndale keeping watch, and watch as was customary in those days, had but few occasions for intercourse. Once, I say, the thick Mr. Franklin, a quaintly bulky figure under the stars, the usual witnesses of his outpourings, asked him with an abruptness which was not callous but in his simple way, "I believe you have no parents living?" Mr. Powell said that he had lost his father and mother at a very early age. "My mother is still alive," declared Mr. Franklin in a tone which suggested that he was gratified by the fact. "The old lady is lasting well. Of course she's got to be made comfortable. A woman must be looked after, and if it comes to that, I say, give me a mother. I dare say if she had not lasted it out so well I might have gone and got married. I don't know, though. We sailors haven't got much time to look about us to any purpose. Anyhow, as the old lady was there I haven't, I may say, looked at a girl in all my life. Not that I wasn't partial to female society in my time," he added with a pathetic intonation, while the whites of his goggle eyes gleamed amorously under the clear night sky. "Very partial, I may say." Mr. Powell was amused, and as these communications took place Only when the mate was relieved off duty he had no serious objection to them. The mate's presence made the first half hour and sometimes even more of his watch on deck pass away. If his senior did not mind losing some of his rest, it was not Mr. Powell's affair. Franklin was a decent fellow. His intention was not to boast of his filial piety. "Of course I mean respectable female society," he explained. "The other sort is neither here nor there. I blame no man's conduct. But a well brought up young fellow like you knows that there's precious little fun to be got out of it." He fetched a deep sigh. "I wish Captain Anthony's mother had been a lasting sort like my old lady. He would have had to look after her and he would have done it well. Captain Anthony is a proper man, and it would have saved him from the most foolish—" He did not finish the phrase, which certainly was turning bitter in his mouth. Mr. Powell thought to himself. "There he goes again." He laughed a little. "I don't understand why you are so hard on the captain, Mr. Franklin. I thought you were a great friend of his." Mr. Franklin exclaimed at this. He was not hard on the captain. Nothing was further from his thoughts. Friend! Of course he was a good friend and a faithful servant. He begged Powell to understand that if Captain Anthony chose to strike a bargain with old Nick to morrow, and old Nick were good to the captain, he, Franklin, would find it in his heart to love old Nick for the captain's sake. That was so. On the other hand, if a saint, an angel with white wings came along and... He broke off short again, as if his own vehemence had frightened him. Then in his strained, pathetic voice, which he had never raised, he observed that it was no use talking. Anybody could see that the man was changed. "As to that," said young Powell, "it is impossible for me to judge." "Good Lord," whispered the mate. "An educated, clever young fellow like you with a pair of eyes on him, and some sense too. Is that how a happy man looks, eh? Young you may be, but you aren't a kid, and I dare you to say yes." Mr. Powell did not take up the challenge. He did not know what to think of the mate's view. Still it seemed as if it had opened his understanding in a measure. He conceded that the captain did not look very well. "Not very well," repeated the mate mournfully. "Do you think a man with a face like that can hope to live his life out? You haven't knocked about long in this world yet, but you are a sailor. You have been in 3 or 4 ships, you say. Well, have you ever seen a shipmaster walking his own deck as if he did not know what he had under foot? Have you? Damn me if I don't think that he forgets where he is. Of course he can be no other than a prime seaman, but it's lucky all the same he has me on board. I know by this time what he wants done without being told. Do you know that I have had no order given me since we left port? Do you know that he has never once opened his lips to me unless I spoke to him first? I, his chief officer, his shipmate for full 6 years, with whom he had no cross word, not once in all that time. Aye, not a cross look even. True that when I do make him speak to me there is his dear old self, the quick eye, the kind voice. Could hardly be other to his old Franklin. But what's the good? Eyes, voice, everything's miles away. And for all that I take good care never to address him when the poop isn't clear. Yes, only we two and nothing but the sea with us. You think it would be all right. The only chief mate he ever had. Mr. Franklin here and Mr. Franklin there. When anything went wrong, the first word you would hear about the decks was, "Franklin!" I am 13 years older than he is. You would think it would be all right, wouldn't you? Only we two on this poop on which we saw each other first, he, a young master, told me that he thought I would suit him very well. We two, and 31 days out at sea, and it's no good. It's like talking to a man standing on shore. I can't get him back. I can't get at him. I feel sometimes as if I must shake him by the arm. Wake up! Wake up! You're wanted, sir." Young Powell recognized the expression of a true sentiment, a thing so rare in this world where there are so many mutes and so many excellent reasons even at sea for an articulate man not to give himself away, that he felt something like respect for this outburst. It was not loud. The grotesque squat shape with the knob of the head as if rammed down between the square shoulders by a blow from a club, moved vaguely in a circumscribed space limited by the 2 harness casks lashed to the front rail of the poop, without gestures, hands in the pockets of the jacket, elbows pressed closely to its side. And the voice without resonance passed from anger to dismay and passed again without a single louder word in the hurried delivery, interrupted only by slight gasps for air as if the speaker were being choked by the suppressed passion of his grief. Mr. Powell, though moved to a certain extent, was by no means carried away, and just as he thought that it was all over, the other, fidgeting in the darkness, was heard again, explosive, bewildered but not very loud, in the silence of the ship and the great empty peace of the sea. "They have done something to him. What is it? What can it be? Can't you guess? Don't you know?" "Good heavens!" Young Powell was astounded at discovering that this was an appeal addressed to him. "How on earth can I know?" "You do talk to that white-faced, black-eyed. I've seen you talking to her more than a dozen times." Young Powell, his sympathy suddenly chilled, remarked in a disdainful tone that Mrs. Anthony's eyes were not black. "I wish to God she had never set them on the captain, whatever colour they are," retorted Franklin. "She and that old chap with the scraped jaws who sits over her and stares down at her dead white face with his yellow eyes, confound them. Perhaps you will tell us that his eyes are not yellow." Powell, not interested in the colour of Mr. Smith's eyes, made a vague gesture. Yellow or not yellow, it was all one to him. The mate murmured to himself, "No, he can't know. No, no more than a baby. It would take an older head." "I don't even understand what you mean," observed Mr. Powell coldly. "And even the best head would be puzzled by such devil work," the mate continued, muttering. "Well, I have heard tell of women doing for a man in one way or another when they got him fairly ashore. But to bring their devilry to sea and fasten on such a man, it's something I can't understand. But I can watch. Let them look out, I say." His short figure, unable to stoop, without flexibility, could not express dejection. He was very tired suddenly. He dragged his feet going off the poop. Before he left it, with nearly an hour of his watch below sacrificed, he addressed himself once more to our young man who stood abreast of the mizzen rigging in an unreceptive mood expressed by silence and immobility. He did not regret, he said, having spoken openly on this very serious matter. "I don't know about its seriousness, sir," was Mr. Powell's frank answer. "But if you think you have been telling me something very new you are mistaken. You can't keep that matter out of your speeches. It's the sort of thing I've been hearing more or less ever since I came on board." Mr. Powell, speaking truthfully, did not mean to speak offensively. He had instincts of wisdom. He felt that this was a serious affair, for it had nothing to do with reason. He did not want to raise an enemy for himself in the mate, and Mr. Franklin did not take offence. To Mr. Powell's truthful statement he answered with equal truth and simplicity that it was very likely, with a thing like that, next door to witchcraft almost, weighing on his mind, the wonder was that he could think of anything else. The poor man must have found in the restlessness of his thoughts the illusion of being engaged in an active contest with some power of evil. For his last words, as he went lingeringly down the poop ladder, expressed the quaint hope that he would get him, Powell, on our side yet. Mr. Powell, just imagine a straightforward youngster assailed in this fashion on the high seas, answered merely by an embarrassed and uneasy laugh, which reflected exactly the state of his innocent soul. The apoplectic mate, already half way down, went up again 3 steps of the poop ladder. Why, yes, a proper young fellow, the mate expected, wouldn't stand by and see a man, a good sailor and his own skipper, in trouble without taking his part against a couple of shore people who, Mr. Powell interrupted him impatiently, asking what was the trouble. "What is it you are hinting at?" he cried with an inexplicable irritation. "I don't like to think of him all alone down there with these two," Franklin whispered impressively. "Upon my word I don't. God only knows what may be going on there. Don't laugh. It was bad enough last voyage when Mrs. Brown had a cabin aft. But now it's worse. It frightens me. I can't sleep sometimes for thinking of him all alone there, shut off from us all." Mrs. Brown was the steward's wife. You must understand that shortly after his visit to the Fyne cottage, with all its consequences, Anthony had got an offer to go to the Western Islands and bring home the cargo of some ship which, damaged in a collision or a stranding, took refuge in St. Michael and was condemned there. Roderick Anthony had connections which would put such paying jobs in his way. So Flora de Barral had but a 5 months' voyage, a mere excursion for her first trial of sea life, and Anthony, dearly trying to be most attentive, had induced this Mrs. Brown, the wife of his faithful steward, to come along as maid to his bride. But for some reason or other this arrangement was not continued, and the mate, tormented by indefinite alarms and forebodings, regretted it. He regretted that Jane Brown was no longer on board as a sort of representative of Captain Anthony's faithful servants, to watch quietly what went on in that part of the ship this fatal marriage had closed to their vigilance. That had been excellent, for she was a dependable woman. Powell did not detect any particular excellence in what seemed a spying employment, but in his simplicity he said that he should have thought Mrs. Anthony would have been glad, anyhow, to have another woman on board. He was thinking of the white-faced girlish personality which it seemed to him ought to have been cared for. The innocent young man always looked upon the girl as immature, something of a child yet. She? Glad? Why, it was she who had her fired out. She didn't want anybody around the cabin. Mrs. Brown is certain of it. She told her husband so. You ask the steward and hear what he has to say about it. That's why I don't like it. A capable woman who knew her place, but no, out she must go. For no fault, mind you. The captain was ashamed to send her away. But that wife of his, aye, the precious air of them has got hold of him. I can't speak to him for a moment on the poop without that thimble-rigging coon coming gliding up. I'll tell you what, I overheard once, God knows I didn't try to, only he forgot I was on the other side of the skylight with my sextant. I overheard him, you know how he sits hanging over his chair and talking away without properly opening his mouth. Yes, I caught the word right enough. He was alluding to the captain as the jailer. The jail. Franklin broke off with a profaned execration. A silence reigned for a long time, and the slight, very gentle rolling of the ship slipping before the northeast trade wind seemed to be a soothing device for lulling to sleep the suspicions of men who trust themselves to the sea. A deep sigh was heard, followed by the mate's voice asking dismally if that was the way one would speak of a man to whom one wished well. No better proof of something wrong was needed. Therefore he hoped, as he vanished at last, that Mr. Powell would be on their side. And this time Mr. Powell did not answer this hope with an embarrassed laugh. That young officer was more and more surprised at the nature of the incongruous revelations coming to him in the surroundings and in the atmosphere of the open sea. It is difficult for us to understand the extent, the completeness, the comprehensiveness of his inexperience. For us who didn't go to sea out of a small private school at the age of 14 years and 9 months, leaning on his elbow in the mizzen rigging, and so still that the helmsman over there on the other side of the poop might have, and he probably did, suspect him of being criminally asleep on duty, he tried to get hold of that thing by some side which would fit in with his simple notions of psychology. What the deuce are they worrying about, he asked himself in a dazed and contemptuous impatience. But all the same, jailer was a funny name to give a man. Unkind, unfriendly, nasty. He was sorry that Mr. Smith was guilty in that matter because, the truth must be told, he had been to a certain extent sensible of having been noticed in a quiet manner by the father of Mrs. Anthony. Youth appreciates that sort of recognition, which is the subtlest form of flattery age can offer. Mr. Smith seized opportunities to approach him on deck. His remarks were sometimes weird and enigmatical. He was doubtless an eccentric old gent, but from that to calling his son-in-law, whom he never approached on deck, nasty names behind his back was a long step. And Mr. Powell marvelled. While he was telling me all this, Marlow changed his tone. I marvelled even more. It was as if misfortune marked its victims on the forehead for the dislike of the crowd. I am not thinking here of numbers. 2 men may behave like a crowd. 3 certainly will when their emotions are engaged. It was as if the forehead of Flora de Barral were marked. Was the girl born to be a victim, to be always disliked and crushed as if she were too fine for this world, or too luckless, since that also is often counted as sin? Yes, I marvelled more since I knew more of the girl than Mr. Powell, if only her true name, and more of Captain Anthony, if only the fact that he was the son of a delicate erotic poet of a markedly refined and autocratic temperament. Yes, I knew their joint stories, which Mr. Powell did not know. The chapter in it he was opening to me, the sea chapter, with such new personages as the sentimental and apoplectic chief mate and the morose steward, however astounding to him in its detached condition, was much more so to me as a member of a series following the chapter outside the Eastern Hotel in which I myself had played my part. In view of her declarations and my sage remarks, it was very unexpected. She had meant well, and I had certainly meant well too. Captain Anthony, as far as I could gather from little Fyne, had meant well. As far as such lofty words may be applied to the obscure personages of this story, we are all filled with the noblest sentiments and intentions. The sea was there to give them the shelter of its solitude, free from the earth's petty suggestions. I could well marvel in myself as to what had happened. I hope that if he saw it, Mr. Powell forgave me the smile of which I was guilty at that moment. The light in the cabin of his little cutter was dim, and the smile was dim too, dim and fleeting. The girl's life had presented itself to me as a tragi-comical adventure, the saddest thing on earth, slipping between frank laughter and unabashed tears. Yes, the saddest facts and the most common, and being common perhaps the most worthy of our unreserved pity. The purely human reality is capable of lyricism, but not of abstraction. Nothing will serve for its understanding but the evidence of rational linking up of characters and facts. And beginning with Flora de Barral, in the light of my memories I was certain that she at least must have been passive, for that is of necessity the part of women, this waiting on fate which some of them, and not the most intelligent, cover up by the vain appearances of agitation. Flora de Barral was not exceptionally intelligent, but she was thoroughly feminine. She would be passive, and that does not mean inanimate, in the circumstances, where the mere fact of being a woman was enough to give her an occult and supreme significance. And she would be enduring, which is the essence of woman's visible, tangible power. Of that I was certain. Had she not endured already? Yet it is so true that the germ of destruction lies in wait for us mortals, even at the very source of our strength, that one may die of too much endurance as well as of too little of it. Such was my train of thought, and I was mindful also of my first view of her, toying or perhaps communing in earnest with the possibilities of a precipice. But I did not ask Mr. Powell anxiously what had happened to Mrs. Anthony in the end. I let him go on in his own way, feeling that no matter what strange facts he would have to disclose, I was certain to know much more of them than he ever did know or could possibly guess. End of part 11.